This is Moosomin, my home and the birthplace of General Andrew McNaughton, a soldier, scientist, and diplomat who shaped our country and changed the world. The following summary of McNaughton's life is mostly drawn from his 3-volume biography published by John Sweetenham in 1968. Sweetenham wrote that something of McNaughton remained rooted in the wide prairies under the forever changing immensity of the sky. Sweetenham credits Moosomin with giving McNaughton his total lack of pomposity, the friendliness that inspired Canadian soldiers to love him like no other general, and to call him simply Andy. In 1882, the Canadian Pacific Railway's Western Expansion Project reached the Moose Mountain Trail, a route used by First Nations trappers supplying the fur trade. As the construction project continued west, a few people remained at the crossing point to establish a settlement. 39-year-old Robert Duncan McNaughton from St. John, New Brunswick, and his cousin, John Whiting, had 3 railway cars worth of goods with which to supply these settlers. They operated out of a tent at first, and then built this wooden store. As the town grew, adventurous families began to arrive. In 1885, William and Anne Crisp came from Ingersoll, Ontario with their 7 children, including Anne's 22-year-old daughter from her first marriage, Christina Armour. The grocer fell in love. R.D. and Christina were married at the newly built St. Albans Anglican Church. The newspaper reported that the bride looked charming in a cream satin dress with orange blossoms and rich white veil. The bouquet which she carried was composed of white hyacinths, which sent forth the sweetest perfume. The dancing was carried on till the morning hours with great spirit. At 4 a.m. the bride and bridegroom drove off amid showers of rice and the hearty cheers and good wishes of their friends. They initially lived on Birtle Street, and it was there that their first son was born a year later, our hero, Andrew George Latta McNaughton. 18 months later, his brother Murray arrived. R.D. then built this larger store of fieldstone, and the family moved in upstairs. The family divided their time between the store and the great outdoors. R.D. built the first log cabin at Kenosi Lake, then called Fish Lake, and they would ride horses over rough trails to go there and fish. Andy loved riding, fishing, hunting, swimming, skating, and curling. His lifelong interest in artillery began when he was 7, and the family took a cross-country train trip to New Brunswick. They attended a ceremonial cannon firing at Fort Carleton, and Andy was allowed to participate. On his return to Moosomin, he began experimenting, making homemade guns from boiler tubing. He aimed at ground squirrels, a very prairie beginning for someone who would go on to be called the best and most scientific gunner in any army in the world. Andy and Murray attended Academy Hall, Moosomin's public school, where a teacher remembered them as splendid little fellows, kind, punctual, studious, and tended by an adoring mother. Andy loved to read, especially true accounts of grand adventures. His academic potential posed a problem, however. In 1900, when Andy was 13, Moosomin did not yet have a high school. Andy and Murray were sent to Bishop's College, a prestigious boarding school in Lennoxville, Quebec. Andy spent 5 years at Bishop's and excelled in every aspect. He had the highest marks in his class and won cups in gymnastics, jumping, and swimming. He thrived in Bishop's Cadet Corps and played on the rugby team. Happy, friendly, and popular, he was the head prefect, equivalent to the class president. When he graduated in 1905, R.D. gave him a present he knew he would love, a shotgun. Andy went on to McGill to study physics and electrical engineering. He took classes from great scientists, including Ernest Rutherford, the father of nuclear physics. Concurrent with his scientific training, Andy was one of fewer than 10 students at McGill who undertook an additional set of classes on military leadership, designed by the British War Office. When Andy was going into his 3rd year, a fire destroyed McGill's electrical laboratories. His studies were put on hold while they were being rebuilt. He returned to Moosomin for a year, his last time ever living in our town. He learned accounting from R.D.'s bookkeeper, Edward Jones, and, for perhaps the only time in his life, wrote poetry. He wrote about the natural beauty around him, where the dull, dark spruce and the maple's lighter green shade the silent reaches of some long unpaddled stream. And he wrote of his dreams for the future. To live out a life worth the while, to set up a mark for the centuries. That last bit he crossed out, perhaps deeming it insufficiently humble. When Andy returned to McGill, Murray was there too, studying medicine. R.D. and Christina decided to move to Montreal to be near their sons. By the time Andy graduated in 1910, the War Office courses he'd taken qualified him for a commission in the British Army. Ever a horseman, he planned to serve in the cavalry in India. Alas, Christina fell gravely ill, and he decided to stay close to home and pursue a master's at McGill. A letter from Christina to Andy around that time gives a sense of their relationship. I am delighted, my dear, at the prospect of having you at home for this next year. We must try to get a comfortable flat so we shall all be able to be together. I'm glad you're going for that little trip to St. John, and 3 days in the saddle will do you a fine lot of good after your exams, and blow the cobwebs out of your brain. I wish I were only able to grasp a little more of the real essence of your work. But I can only enjoy and appreciate all you try to explain to me, dear. Neither do I wonder at your high ambition to gain the highest degree possible. That is quite the proper spirit to have, and I trust you will succeed and win everything you set out to conquer. Andy graduated from his master's degree in 1912, then stayed on as a lecturer and researcher of high-voltage electricity and its technologies. His papers included Transient and Permanent Phenomena in Electric Series Transformers, which appeared in the Transactions of the Royal Society of Canada. Throughout his master's, Andy maintained his interest in the military, but as a hobby. Canada did not have a professional army at that time, but it did have a militia somewhat similar to the modern reserves. Volunteers trained just 10 or 20 days per year and earned a small stipend. Montreal was home to the 3rd Field Battery, a unit that had kept peace in the streets a few times in its history, including an anti-vax riot in 1885, but had enjoyed 25 uneventful years of friendly training exercises when Andy joined up. Andy excelled at part-time peacetime soldiering. He became proficient with the 18-pounder field gun, so named because each shell weighed 18 pounds. He was chosen to compete in an artillery competition in England, and soon after became the commander of the 3rd Field Battery. 1913 was sorrow and joy. Sorrow when Christina passed away at age 49, and joy when Andy became engaged to Mabel Weir, the 18-year-old daughter of an old Montreal family. Andy and Mabel had actually danced together at a house party 3 years prior, but it was in that last year of peace that they fell in love fast. Mabel was Catholic, and they needed to procure special permission from the Catholic Church for an interfaith marriage. They had received this dispensation, but not yet married, when a student in Sarajevo shot an archduke, and the world cracked in half. On August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Canada did not yet have sovereignty over its external affairs, and so we were automatically at war as well. World War I ultimately became a total war, in which 600,000 Canadians served. But it didn't start that way at all. Britain expected the conflict to be over by Christmas, and only asked Canada to contribute a single division. In military parlance, a division is a subsection of a corps containing multiple brigades, which in turn are made of smaller units, which, if they're infantry, are called battalions, if they're cavalry, are called regiments, and if they are artillery, are called batteries. Canada's militia had 36 field batteries, and a division only required 9. Andy was gratified that his Montreal 3rd Field Battery was one of the 9 chosen to mobilize. The newly formed Canadian Expeditionary Force gathered at Valcartier outside Quebec City for training and restructuring. McNaughton's 3rd Battalion became the 4th Battalion of the 2nd Brigade, as Camp Valcartier filled up with white teepee-like tents. Andy and Mabel were determined to get married before the Canadian Expeditionary Force left for overseas. Mabel's mother absolutely forbade it, so they eloped in the night. They had a priest meet them at a telephone exchange with 2 witnesses they didn't know. The wedding was on September 17th, and the force sailed out on October 3rd. Andy had no leave during those 16 days, but slipped away to see his bride at the Chateau Frontenac as often as he could. And Mabel came to Camp Valcartier whenever it was open to the public. She was there when the Duke of Connaught inspected the troops. Andy wrote in a letter, "I was glad to see you at the review by HRH, even if I did get called for grinning and dipping my sword to you. It was worth the breaking of discipline to catch your wave and smile." When Andy's battery was stowed on the ocean liner Ivernia to go overseas, both Mabel and R.D. hopped on a tender bringing last-minute supplies to the ship so they could catch one more glimpse of Andy. For the lovebirds, that was not actually the start of a long parting, because 1 month later Mabel sailed to England. It was, however, the last time that Andy saw his father. R.D. died in May at the age of 73. The Ivernia was one of over 30 ships that made the transatlantic journey as Canada's Great Armada. During the crossing, Andy gave on-board lectures on the 18-pounder field gun and how it could best be used alongside infantry. Once in England, the Canadian Expeditionary Force reported to Salisbury Plain for training, and once again restructuring. Andy was disgusted when his 4th battery became the 7th battery and went from having 6 field guns to only 4. Worse, Salisbury Plain was so miserably muddy that his battery's horses sunk up to their knees. Andy took the initiative to cut down trees to make planks for the horses to stand on. Unfortunately, that ran afoul of a rule, and his superiors briefly considered relieving him of command over the infraction. That winter in England was cold, wet, and windy. Andy had a much more pleasant layover than most of the other soldiers, though, because his resilient wife frequently walked miles over Salisbury Plain to spend time with him. She was able to attend the artillery's 26-course Christmas dinner, and, when the battery embarked for France, the brigade commander insisted that she bring them all good luck by loading the first round in the first field gun that they packed for the journey. Andy sailed to France on the Novian, a rough crossing that took 5 days instead of the ordinary day and a half. When the Canadians arrived in Saint-Nazaire, there was a stevedores' strike happening. Someone needed to operate the derrick to bring the equipment ashore, and Andy volunteered. It went well, except for one motor car tilting so much that a commander's bedroll fell into the sea. Andy was teased about that for months. The Canadian Expeditionary Force spent the remainder of March well back from the action, learning from British troops with frontline experience. Once again, Andy's problem-solving initiative got him reprimanded. The two-wheeled carts used to transport the field guns had rifle hooks designed to hold British service rifles. The Canadian-made Ross rifles issued to Canadian soldiers were longer, so when forced into the hooks that didn't really fit, they stuck out and got caught in the wheels. Andy solved the problem for his battery by procuring British rifles. He was reprimanded and ordered to use the Canadian guns. It was a disastrous order because, quite apart from the cart issue, the Ross rifle proved too unreliable for battle. Again, standardization was partially to blame. Different definitions of an inch used in manufacturing on the two sides of the ocean meant that British cartridges were slightly too large for the Ross, and often got stuck in the barrel. Andy was frustrated that the Canadian Minister of Defense, Colonel Hughes, just wouldn't take no for an answer in the face of the experts and everybody else. When Andy later rose to high leadership positions, including himself becoming Minister of Defense in World War II, his defining trait was listening to the people on the ground. On Mabel's birthday, Andy wrote to her that he saw some wild violets. But as I was with a general, I did not get a chance to pick any for you. He described beautiful weather and a most gorgeous sunset. The sun went down in a heavy bank of cloud and a large rift appeared. A shaft of soft rosy light came out of the black austere mass of cloud. The moon rose and it was nearly full. A few shell stars in the background made one realize that it was not peace, but war. The Canadian experience of World War I truly began on April 14, 1915, when the Canadian Division was sent into the Ypres salient. A salient is a portion of land controlled by one army that juts into enemy territory. If we consider World War I as a whole, the Western Front moved very little. This time-lapse shows the battle lines every day of the war, as a narrow strip of France and Belgium is taken and retaken by the opposing sides. The basic problem was one of geometry. If either army managed to capture some land, creating a salient, it was surrounded by the enemy and therefore very difficult to hold. On April 14th, the Canadian Division and 2 British divisions relieved 3 French ones in the salient, with 1 French division, the 45th Algerian, remaining in place. The Algerians were in the north of the salient, the Canadians in the northeast, and the British in the southeast. As his first assignment at the front, Andy was ordered to drop shells systematically every 20 yards on the German side. It was a perfect task for Andy, who relished accuracy. He brandished a thermometer to account for the temperature of the shells and closely watched where each one landed to adjust as necessary. Andy called it one of the best days I had in the war. He wasn't told why the higher-ups wanted a shell dropped every 20 yards. The reason was a dark one. Intelligence reports indicated that the Germans were planning an attack unprecedented in the history of war, a release of poisonous chlorine gas. The systematic shell drop was intended to locate the canisters. It didn't work because the canisters weren't on the northeast line facing the Canadians. They were on the northern line facing the Algerians. On April 22nd, the Germans were raining shells on the town of Ypres, setting it ablaze. But that was merely a distraction. The wind was right, and the Germans released 170 tons of chlorine gas. The olive-green cloud, heavier than air, sunk into the Algerian trenches, quickly killing between 800 and 1,400 soldiers. Hundreds more fled the trenches in agony, clawing at their throats. Andy recalled that they came running back as if the devil was after them, their eyeballs showing white, and coughing their lungs out. They literally were coughing their lungs out. Glue was coming out of their mouths. It was a very disturbing, very distressing sight. The 4-mile gap opened up by the gas attack would have allowed the Germans to seize the entire salient, if not for the Canadians' position on the high ground at Gravenstoffel Ridge, where the cool and collected Arthur Currie was in charge. On the 24th, the Germans released gas once more, this time aimed at the Canadians. the brunt of it finding Lipsett's 8th Battalion. Lipsett ordered his men to urinate on cloths and tie them near their mouths, which helped neutralize the chlorine. Coughing and with stinging eyes streaming with tears, they stood firm. And on a phone with Lipsett all throughout the battle was Andy, in an observation post on Gravenstoffel Ridge, coordinating the artillery fire that targeted the Germans from concealed positions. Andy was patient. When the Germans lined up to attack, he shelled them. Then he waited for them to line up again, and he shelled them again. All through the night, Lipsett and Andy and their men held the Germans back. At dawn, a German shell burst in front of Andy, blowing him backward at least 10 feet. The shell went through his left shoulder and completely disabled his arm. Yet he remained at his post for another 12 hours. Orderlies held up his maps and telephones as he energetically continued the fine fight. The next night, he at last reported to a dressing station to have his shoulder tended. As soon as he arrived, though, there was a god-awful concentration of fire, during which he suffered a concussion and lost consciousness. He came to 50 kilometers away at the St. Omer Hospital. From there, he was sent back to England. Andy was treated at the Royal Victoria Hospital at Netley, with Mabel visiting him every day. The doctors initially stated that he would never use his left arm again. But when a nurse probed into the wound and removed a 3-inch strip of his uniform that was lodged inside, his shoulder began to heal. He still had no movement in his hand, though, and was discharged with the expectation that he would be permanently disabled. The couple moved to Kensington and found new ways to be useful. With Mabel holding the paper and drawing lines as instructed, Andy created a range card to help gunners use the 18-pounder to engage moving targets. Then he set about designing a new type of shell, though it never went into production. His main work, though, was straining for hours, with sweat rolling down his face, willing his hand to move. He eventually persuaded it to at least flop on demand. On August 10th, Mabel gave birth to a daughter, Christina, named for Andy's mother. Soon after, Andy traveled to Udny Castle in Scotland, which was being used as a convalescent home for wounded officers. There, he attempted to satisfy a medical board so he could return to active duty. He was rejected once, then, after 3 more weeks of training his hand, deemed fit for service. Andy was assigned to the Canadian Artillery Depot at Shorncliffe. The war had not gone well in the months that Andy was away. It had become clear that the Germans' howitzer field guns were outperforming the British 18-pounders. An 18-pounder is designed to decimate an advancing line of infantry. It is quick-firing and shoots in a relatively flat trajectory across a direct sight line. The shells burst in the air on a timed fuse, raining musket balls down on the enemy soldiers. A howitzer is designed to destroy field guns. It is slower to load, maxing out at perhaps 6 rounds per minute, but it shoots in a great arc, allowing it to shoot from a concealed location. This capacity for indirect fire made it the superior weapon when the war moved from open fields to trenches. The British side needed howitzer brigades, and when the second contingent of Canadians arrived, it included gunners for that purpose. In October 1915, McNaughton was given command of the 21st Battery of the 6th Howitzer Brigade. In January 1916, the 6th Howitzer Brigade crossed to France. Andy knew that for the howitzers to be effective, especially during what was a critical munitions shortage, they needed to locate their targets precisely. As he developed more scientific methods for doing that, he faced resistance. As he put it, a lot of the old traditional gunners, when they found these sorts of things were coming in and that people were trying to develop accuracy in shooting, were appalled. Anyone who did it was looked at as someone who ought to have his head read. This wasn't war at all, this was some sort of fandoodle.
One of the new methods he championed was flash spotting. He positioned telephonists at different locations to report the angle at which they observed flashes from an enemy machine gun firing at night. Where the observation lines crossed on a map, the gun was sure to be. Andy paired accurately locating targets with accurately shooting them. He accounted for the barometric pressure, the wind, the air temperature, and the charge temperature. He wrote to Mabel, "The guns I can all but talk to and get the shells where I want them." And, "The battery is working to perfection, and in all my experience I've never had guns follow the helm so well and uniformly. I love you, and I think of you all the time, even perhaps when I am shooting. I wish you could see the shells fall on the Huns." The higher-ups shared his proud assessment. After only 2 months commanding the 21st Battery, Andy was promoted to lieutenant colonel and recalled to England to take command of an entire brigade, part of the newly arriving 3rd Canadian Division. Only 29, he would be the youngest brigade commander in the service by 5 years. Andy spent 3 months in England training his new brigade, and remembered them as 3 of the nicest months I've ever had in my life. He saw Mabel and Christina on the weekends, and the men loved him. One recalled, "We were the hardest worked brigade in the division. We did not grouse about that, we boasted of it.
It is a sign of a real leader that he could set a hard, exacting task and get cheerful obedience. They loved that Andy, mounted on a horse called Quickfire, won every race. They loved that his rank afforded him a cot, but he chose to sleep on the floor like his men. While other officers warmed themselves with elaborate iron stoves, he punched holes in an oil drum. Andy and the 11th Brigade sailed for France just 6 days before Mabel gave birth to his son and namesake, and 2 days after the powers that be swapped out 3 of his sharply trained howitzer batteries for 3 18-pounder batteries that he'd never met before. Andy was mortified when General Julian Byng inspected his troops and scolded and shamed him for the grimy condition of the horses, not knowing that Andy, too, was seeing them for the first time. In July 1916, the northern part of the Western Front, including the Ypres salient, was relatively quiet, while some of the bloodiest battles in the history of mankind were being waged further south at the Somme. Generally speaking, a division's components fight together. For example, the 3rd Division's artillery serves alongside the 3rd Division's infantry. On this instance, however, the more experienced Lahore artillery accompanied the 3rd Division south into hell, while Andy and the artillery stayed in the salient with the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. It was, he recalled, very pleasant light trench warfare, fighting if you want to put it that way, raiding and that kind of thing, and a fine lot of people to work with. For the last 2 of the battles of the Somme, the Battle of Anchor Heights and the Battle of Anchor, the situation reversed. Most of the Canadian force was not involved, but the artillery was. Andy was, and it was grim. He recalled,
"During the 4 weeks or so that we were on the Somme, I don't suppose there was half an hour, day or night, in which a shell didn't land within 100 yards of my headquarters."
That headquarters was a hollow dug in the mud with a tin roof concealed by sod, in which Andy huddled with his staff and telephonists. 2 boots jutted out from one wall, still attached to an otherwise buried corpse, and they used them to hang their gas masks up out of the mud. There were other bodies all around. They had an improvised pump and took turns keeping the putrid water down, away from the tech and Andy's textbooks. He remembered, somehow you couldn't tell the higher commands what the conditions were, and those of us who were in the front at that time, and the filth and the muck and the mire of it, and the inefficiency of it, we didn't know enough to resent it. Andy's gunners, at least, had a commanding officer they could talk to. One wrote, "He was the darndest man for wanting to know how things were going in his brigade. He came to the gun pits, hopped on a pile of shells, and had a mug of tea with the boys." I do not recall any other officer sharing our mugs of tea. When Regina Trench and Desire Trench were captured, and the battles of the Somme over, Andy went wearily north toward Vimy. We were all full of rheumatism, and there wasn't much left of us after the Somme was over, I can tell you. When it was time to go, I just couldn't get aboard. I walked and led my horse away down the road. The top brass of the Canadian Corps did not want a repeat of the Somme, where soldiers were mowed down by the thousands. They wanted their artillery to eliminate enemy guns with scientific precision and protect the infantry as they advanced. In January 1917, they created a new position to achieve those goals, the counter-battery staff officer. Any number of higher-ranked officers would have jumped at the job, but they knew the man they wanted, Andy McNaughton. The job came with a Napier motor car, and all he was responsible for was the fate of his nation. Andy's first task as counter-battery staff officer was a fact-finding mission to the French armies to see what techniques they were using. He was not impressed. The highfalutin folks offered the most wonderful dissertation on the coordination of artillery fire, but out in the field the French were a damn sloppy outfit. Their stuff was tied together with binder twine and string and haywire. They put on bursts of fire, but the idea of accuracy simply was not there. One learned that it's a damn good thing that those who are running the higher stuff should know exactly what was going on in the field and not be full of fancies. He wrote to Mabel, "Not very happy with my new job yet, and I would give a great deal to be back with my brigade. The principal trouble with it at present is that it's so indefinite. If I could only get to work on something tangible, it would not be so bad." The next stop on Andy's fact-finding mission was the British Army's 5th Corps, where he learned more in 24 hours than in all his time with the French. In that corps, the practices on the ground aligned with the directives from headquarters, and they were making coordinated use of aerial reconnaissance from planes and balloons, more sophisticated methods of flash spotting, and a technique that was new to Andy, sound ranging. By positioning 6 or more microphones across the landscape and comparing the times at which they detected an enemy gun firing, you could locate the gun. And by also comparing when they detected the resulting shell burst, they could locate the target. By comparing the two, they could know the range of the weapon and therefore its type. The recording and calculating could all be done in just 3 minutes. Andy, who was already familiar with oscillographs from his time at McGill, immediately understood the potential. He invited the scientists to the Canadian trenches and made them immensely welcome. In fact, they became his lifelong friends. From 5th Corps, Andy learned how to rapidly collate intelligence from multiple sources and make instant use of it. He would perfect their methods to create the greatest counter-battery system in any army in the world. Andy became the spider in the center of a massive intelligence web, translating aerial photographs and telephonist reports into precise orders that picked off enemy guns one after another.
So we also laid out a full-size model of the ridge for the men to practice on. They know where every German strongpoint is, every machine gun, every bunker.
General Curry, you do know the French have tried for the last year to take Vimy Ridge, yes? And that we also...
I know, sir.
What exactly makes you,
Our guns will begin at dawn.
While Andy was creating the counter-battery plan for the upcoming Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge, he got a surprising new friend. One of his staff returned from leave in Paris with a 4-month-old lion cub named Antonio. The Paris Zoo had been going to kill the cub because of the wartime food shortages. Tony took an instant liking to Andy, sleeping under his desk and riding in his car with him as he toured the batteries. Vimy Ridge is considered the battle that made Canada a nation. For the first time, 4 Canadian divisions with soldiers from every part of the country fought as one, and they triumphed. In fact, much of the winning was done before the battle began. For the 3 weeks leading up to Easter, while the infantry rehearsed on a replica of the ridge, Andy's counter-battery program was already in place, firing on enemy guns and trenches. They also blew down the lines of barbed wire, creating a path for the infantry. For the first 2 weeks, Andy was only allowed to fire half of his guns to conceal the Canadian Army's full strength. In the final week, he was allowed to unleash that strength. Amid constant snow flurries, his team fired 125,900 shells and eliminated 83% of the German guns. The Germans called it the Week of Suffering. When the infantry took to the ridge, many of the Canadian guns shifted to provide the rolling barrage, the wall of fire directly in front of the infantry that protected them. That work was overseen by a different officer. Andy had control of the remaining guns and was tasked with neutralizing the remaining enemy batteries. On April 12th, the battle was won. The champagne flowed. Andy's favorite memory of the celebration concerned a tipsy colonel who came to congratulate him wearing boots and riding breeches that were just a little too shiny and caught the eye of the lion cub under Andy's desk. Tony pounced and nipped the colonel, who let out a high-pitched shriek and ran from the room as Andy's staff collapsed in laughter. As celebrated as Vimy Ridge was, though, Andy wasn't entirely satisfied with it. Some of the enemy batteries tucked in the woods on the reverse slope of the ridge eluded his intelligence network longer than they should have. He vowed that in the next battle he would miss nothing. The next battle was the attack on Hill 70. It was the first one with a Canadian in command of the Canadian Corps, the brilliant Arthur Currie. Currie and Andy had a great relationship. Throughout the war, Andy was Currie's favorite talking block, his preferred person to articulate his plans and arguments to before he presented them to British or French commanders or the overseas minister. Andy offered a scientist's logical analysis in a prairie boy's plain talk. For the infantry, Hill 70 was a battle of attrition, with heavy losses on both sides. But for McNaughton's artillery, it was an unqualified success. There was instant wireless communication from observation planes and observers on the ground. Every time the Germans attempted to assemble, their positions were known precisely, and the shells rained down. A few days after that battle, Andy had a harrowing experience unlike any other. Not for the first time, he took on the nerve-wracking but necessary work of observing the front from the wicker basket of a tethered observation balloon. He and a Captain Graham were 3,000 feet up when there was a flash and bump. An enemy gun, a giant railway gun with a 62-kilometer range, had almost hit them. Andy and Graham phoned the winch operators on the ground and asked to be brought down, but were told that that couldn't happen. Descending the balloon would reveal the location of the winch to the enemy gunner. Andy and Graham prepared to parachute down. They hung from the sides, counted down from 3, but then neither of them let go. "My hands wouldn't let me," Andy recalled. They climbed back into the balloon, and then there was nothing for them to do but endure, while the winch operators kept the balloon moving in an attempt to prevent the enemy gunner from getting a good shot. When the German gun was loading, the winch operators brought the balloon to a relatively low altitude, perhaps 300 feet up. Then, just when the gun would be ready to fire, they would release the balloon to fly up by 500 or 600 feet in a dizzying flurry. Andy and Graham rode that awful amusement park ride until darkness fell, and the balloon could finally be brought down safely. Back on solid ground, Andy drank a good amount of whiskey and rum and plotted his revenge. It took 10 days, but he destroyed that railway gun. Soon after, the Canadian Corps was called to the battle that Andy considered the most dreadful of the lot, Passchendaele. They were asked to relieve the Anzac troops at Gravenstoffel Ridge, the exact same piece of land they had first reported to in April 1915. Now it was October 1917, and the ground had been turned to sludge. Andy recalled, We were coming in at the tail end of a dogfight that had been going on through the mud, and had people's energies used up not in fighting, but in overcoming the physical handicaps of moving through a country in which all the undersurface drainage has been broken, destroyed, and where he had no bottom to the soil at all. The whole struggle was against the terrain and not against the enemy. Morale was gone, and the effectiveness of the artillery was played out, and I don't think it was the fault of the men. They were just physically worn out. Currie realized that a quick advance would fail because the big guns would get stuck in the mud. The only hope for covering fire was to advance the infantry slow enough to build roads and platforms as they went. Andy's counter-battery program was effective, and relatively few of the Canadian casualties were from German heavy artillery. But casualties there were. 15,654 Canadian soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing in the 28-day slog through the mud. When the force captured its objective, and the task turned to defending it, Andy prioritized establishing an artillery observation post in no man's land. When he first trekked out to the pillbox that would serve for that purpose, he prudently brought a pigeon. The bird flew back to headquarters in half an hour, while it took a full day to get the radio working. Tony also proved to be a useful animal at Passchendaele. Back at artillery headquarters, he got spooked when a bomb dropped from a German airplane near his cage. After that, he whined every time an airplane was headed their way, before any human ears could hear it. After Passchendaele, Andy was ordered back to England for a course on siege artillery. He spent time with his wife and children and enjoyed partridge shooting, using a German rifle that he altered to fire shotgun shells. On his return to France, Andy was sent for a second time to observe the French army. He and 3 other delegates, including British supply officer Maurice Taylor, met with Louis-Ernest de Mauduit for technical discussions, food, and drink. Andy and Taylor were being escorted to a billet by 2 French officers when a German plane flew overhead and dropped a cluster of splinter bombs. Andy lost consciousness, and when he came to, found that the French officers were dead, and Taylor was missing. Swaying from blood loss, and alone in a town he'd never been to before, Andy somehow found his way back to de Mauduit's mess, where he bled all over the carpet. The French soon found Taylor, who was also severely injured. When the 2 recovered in hospital, their host sent them buckets of champagne. Andy needed 60 stitches and was allowed another short trip to England to convalesce. At the port, on his return to France, Andy ran into a friend. Tony the lion, now too big to be a front-line pet, was now being moved to the London Zoo. Another Canadian Army mascot was living at the London Zoo at the same time, Winnie the bear. While Winnie went on to inspire children's stories, Tony soon died of rickets. Andy returned to a Canadian Army that was away from the front, restructuring for a new phase. The Americans were arriving. The Germans had been pushed back behind the River Vey, and the years of trench warfare were drawing to a close. To quote Andy, "I wanted to get a much more flexible organization, for the conditions we saw would come to us when we broke through the line. The transition to open warfare had to be mighty carefully planned. There was no useful purpose to be served in lugging around a lot of those short-range 9.2-inch howitzers that took 36 hours to emplace. I wanted everything on wheels." Andy trained highly mobile brigades and a new reconnaissance unit suited to the new situation. He also experimented with a new artillery method called airburst ranging that he would use extensively in the next war. The other 2 main changes going into the final phase of the war were that Andy, while retaining the title of counter-battery staff officer, became the de facto head of all the heavy artillery. The nominal head, Brigadier General R.H. Massey, was physically present, but suffering terribly from a chronic illness. He offloaded many of his duties to Andy. Second, the sterling reputation of the Canadian Corps had reached the enemy. The Germans now referred to the Canadians by the name of their own elite commando unit, as stormtroopers. The Germans now knew to expect an attack wherever the Canadian Corps mustered. It now became imperative for the Canadian movement plans to be kept secret, even from the soldiers themselves. At the end of July, the Canadian soldiers, and hopefully the German army, prepared for an attack on Arras. Only a handful of people knew that the actual plan was to attack at Amiens. Andy was one of them. He was at Amiens in an Australian uniform, using every means available to covertly locate every enemy gun in the area. He was also scouting out the territory for hedges and trees that could conceal Canadian guns. He wrote up detailed orders for each gun before his army arrived. They would be shooting from the map, that is, engaging targets that the gunners could not see. They would not, therefore, be able to make any on-the-fly adjustments to account for any individual differences in the muzzle velocity of their particular weapon. So, when the guns arrived in the area, he had each one tested by shooting through screens rigged to an electric timing device. The orders were adjusted accordingly. On the night of August 7th, Andy wrote a letter to Mabel, adding to it in bits and pieces as the anxious hours wore on. At 11:51, Sweetheart mine, a droll place I am in at the moment. An old ruined castle which dates from before the Middle Ages, and it must have seen some old battles in its day, but nothing to what is going to be let loose in a few hours. So far, so good. The element of the operation is surprise. If the Germans had known about it and put down counter-preparation and effective long-distance harassing fire on our roads and bridges, we would never have been able to deploy for action. The thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies that have gone forward in the last few nights is almost incredible. In front of me is a chart showing where we're going to fire and when, and with any luck we should fairly swamp the enemy's batteries. I have very nearly gun for counter-battery work alone, and all this concentration of firepower made undetected by the enemy. At least it appears to be undetected. Perhaps he knows of it and is waiting to catch us in a trap. Who knows? The next few hours will tell. At 12:15. I wonder if the ghosts of dead and gone warriors are standing around looking on. If they are, they must think this a very funny war. Dee-dee-da-da-da goes the buzzer of my telephone. Hello, and I am talking to a man many hours' walk away. Another call, and I speak as far or farther in the opposite direction. A slight hum from the wireless, and we get messages from goodness knows how far away. And all this to control long tubes of steel, which throw out other bits of steel that go many miles off and go off with a bang against an enemy one never sees, but whose location and habits are deduced from photographs, survey posts, sound rangers, and goodness only knows what other scientific refinements of the modern art of man-killing. At 2:25, another couple of hours' quietness, and we will be all right. At 3:27, feeling very tired but confident, just 50 more minutes till several hundreds of our guns will open up. At 4:08, only 12 minutes now, and all is quiet. It looks as if our surprise will come off. At 4:20, they are off, well together and on time all along the front. A terrific racket. The Boche is getting his now. Long live Canada. The enemy batteries were thoroughly neutralized, and tanks rolled across the battlefield. The element of surprise was so effective that in addition to the enemy they killed and the weapons they destroyed, the Canadians captured 5,000 prisoners and 161 guns. Historians consider the Battle of Amiens the most decisive of World War I, and Andy's meticulous planning was at its center. The war wasn't over yet. For the next battle, they undertook the attack on Arras that was planned as the cover for Amiens. As Andy put it, "We carried out the attack that we had planned 5 weeks earlier. Not a bit of it was wasted. It had not only been good camouflage, it was a thorough preparation for what became a very, very important second phase of the main attack on the Western Front." For Andy, Arras was like Amiens. His meticulous battle plans were followed, and the enemy batteries were blasted from the map one after another. The only difference was that he had a new tool to blast them with. A group of light bomber aircraft were placed under his command. Amiens and Arras were the beginning of a continuous run of Allied attacks now known as the 100 Days Offensive. The next few angered Andy. He felt that infantry lives were unnecessarily lost by sending them forward before the counter-battery work was complete. The next one that was planned to his satisfaction was Canal du Nord, which was like Amiens, a total victory achieved with the element of surprise. Andy wrote to Mabel, "It was a wonderful day for Canada and a terrific blow to the Germans. The end of the war is drawing appreciably close." Those words reached Mabel around the time she gave birth to their third child, Edward, called Teddy. At the same time, General Massey's worsening health forced him to step down, and Andy officially became the commander of the Canadian Corps Heavy Artillery. As it turned out, his first battle as acting brigadier general was the last battle of the war with Canadian Heavy Artillery, Valenciennes. As the Corps was mustering for that engagement, Andy witnessed one of the most magnificent moments of the war. The sky filled with enemy planes, and Manitoban flying ace William Barker bested them all, winning the Victoria Cross. On the ground, though, Valenciennes began badly. The Germans repelled the first attack. Andy requested that Currie pause the action so they could plan an artillery barrage free from the hysteria of a suddenly improvised attack. That they did, and on the night before the morning of November 1st, Andy wrote to Mabel, "I feel confident that our infantry is going to have the best artillery support available. As a matter of fact, it is the most intense heavy artillery barrage that has ever been put on. And I am rather afraid that the Army will accuse us of over-expenditure of ammunition, but I don't mind that." Andy and Currie always believed in paying the price of victory in shells, not lives. Valenciennes achieved that. The Canadians expended 2,149 tons of ammunition, almost as much as the entire Boer War. 80 Canadians laid down their lives, while 800 Germans lost theirs. Another 1,800 Germans surrendered. The road to Valenciennes filled with townspeople bringing the Canadians flowers, coffee, and wine, weeping for joy that 4 years of German occupation was over. The scene repeated itself as the Corps marched into Mons on the 10th of November. Andy wrote that his officers, Crerar and Napier, were kissed on several occasions, but this treatment so far I have managed to dodge. Mons passed into Allied hands after some street fighting, but no shelling. The next morning, Andy learned that the war would end at 11 a.m. Sweetenham's biography states that he grunted, "Bloody fools, we have them on the run. That means that we shall have to do it all over again in another 25 years. I wonder if he actually reacted that way or if hindsight caused him to confabulate. The victorious Allies paraded into Germany. Andy recalled that the German waiters spoke perfect English and the service was perfect. They seemed to pretend that such thing as war had never taken place. He went hunting in Germany and got a fox that made the local Jägermeisters declare him king of the hunt. Andy didn't balk at going out shooting recreationally with the same people he'd shot at for 4 years. He was a man ready for peace. He planned to go back to Montreal and electrical engineering, to a quiet life of coils and transformers. Currie had something else in mind for him. The Canadian government needed a plan for reabsorbing all of the units of the Canadian Corps that were created overseas back into the structure of the peacetime militia. They wanted a commission of 4 men to figure out how to stuff the genie back into the bottle. Currie thought that Andy should be one of them. Andy wrote to Mabel, "He offered me the work of going to Canada to advise the government on the reconstitution of the military forces of the country. One other general will also go. I feel rather proud to be one of 2 generals from the whole Corps to be picked for this work. I am to meet Sir Robert Borden in Brussels on Saturday. It means considerable financial sacrifice, but we'll have enough to live in comfort and to educate and bring up the children. I do not think money matters very much." After lunch I went for a bit of a walk and picked a pussy willow for luck. "Do you remember the ones on the mountain I used to bring you, my darling? We little thought then of all that has befallen us." Andy kept that lucky pussy willow for the rest of his life. The Otter Commission was named for its official head, Sir William Otter, a 75-year-old who had spent the war overseeing the deplorable internment of Ukrainian Canadians and other so-called enemy aliens within Canada. Most of the Commission's recommendations were not written by Otter, however, but by Andy. Andy sought to balance 2 realities. On the one hand, he did not believe that he had just lived through the war to end all wars. He predicted that Canada would go to war again eventually, and if that happened, they would want to mobilize much faster than in 1914. On the other hand, Andy believed that funding a large standing army would hamper economic development. The compromise he envisioned was a small, highly trained permanent force and a much larger reserve force that would train on a part-time basis, like he had before the war. In particular, he wanted engineers and signalers to develop their skills in civilian contexts that would build the country, but be trained to apply their skills in uniform if the need arose. Part of the Commission's work was to decide which existing militia units tied to particular Canadian towns would take on the names and war honors of units created overseas, and which would constitute the new permanent force. Andy insisted that the permanent force should include 1 French battalion that would retain the name and battle honors of the 22nd Battalion, which was a mainstay of the Canadian Corps during the war. He also insisted that Western Canada have a part in the permanent force, and that it should be Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. The Royal Vendeuxième Regiment, commonly known as the Vendeus, and the PPCLI remain important parts of the Canadian Armed Forces to this day. Most of the internal structure of the contemporary CAF was shaped by the Otter Commission. When the Commission's work drew to a close, Andy once again planned to return to civilian life, and Currie once again stepped in to suggest that he remain in the military. He wanted Andy to enroll in the British Army's Senior Officer Training Course, and then serve in Canada's new permanent force. In a twist, Andy suggested that Currie be the one to go civilian and accept an offer to become the principal of McGill. He did, and he thrived in that role for the rest of his life. Andy, Mabel, and their now 4 children, baby Ian arrived in 1919, spent 1921 back in England. Andy excelled in every aspect of the training course. His final report card described him as an officer of exceptional attainment, with immense powers of concentration and great strength of character. As soon as Andy was back on Canada's soil, he was given an emergency assignment by the new Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King. Cape Breton coal miners were on strike.
Now, of all the bosses that e'er was cursed, Roy the Wolf was called the worst. Greedy, growling wolf for more, he stole the bread from the worker's door.
The head of the militia in Nova Scotia, H.C. Thacker, was empowered to keep the peace, but Mackenzie King was concerned that he might take excessive action and inflame the situation. The task of ensuring that Thacker's response remained moderate and within the legal limits of the Militia Act would have fallen to the Chief of the General Staff, McBrien, but he was on vacation, so it fell to Andy. The mine strike resolved quickly with no loss of life. It is impossible to say whether Andy stayed Thacker's hand and prevented a disaster, or whether the tensions would have eased just as soon without his involvement. Regardless, Andy's cool-headed diplomacy impressed Mackenzie King. Andy was appointed the Deputy Chief of the General Staff under McBrien. The following summer, another strike erupted in Cape Breton when McBrien was not on vacation. McBrien ordered hundreds of members of the regular force to suppress the strike, which King found entirely excessive.
Soldiers at every colony, you know.
They settled it all right, but only by brute force. Imagine the company calling on the government to send in the troops.
There was blood and chaos. From then on, King called on his deputy chief instead of the chief whenever he could. One of Andy's tasks was to represent Canada's military interests on a joint commission, drafting a treaty for Canada and the United States to develop the St. Lawrence River for navigation. Because of his engineering background, Andy participated directly in the technical studies conducted by the Joint Board of Engineers. The commission arrived at a plan which was technically sound and would benefit both countries. Alas, the proposed treaty failed to get the required 2/3 majority vote in the U.S. Senate. It was a case of unrealized potential that Andy would return to 30 years later. Andy's most passionate pursuit in the 1920s was ensuring that Canada would have expert aviators and signalers if another war came. The lean military budget could not keep planes in the air or invest in cutting-edge communication technology purely as a preparedness effort. So Andy devised a plan to meet the military need while enriching the taxpayer. Andy's pitch was that the Canadian North was a treasure trove of minerals. Finding and accessing them would require aerial surveys, which could be conducted by the Canadian Air Force, while meteorological stations connected by wireless communication could be operated by the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals. Andy challenged the accepted wisdom that the military is an economic drain by championing projects in which the military created conditions for economic growth. In this spirit, he oversaw the creation of the Vickers Vedette, a biplane suitable for aerial surveys. Canada became the world leader in map-making. Critically, he ordered that at least half of the Air Force's training be conducted in civilian operations. If another war did come, no one would complain that the flying aces had been trained on the Forest Service dime. Perhaps the most surprising thing about Andy's achievements as an administrator is that he continued to do science on the side. In 1925, he and a colleague, W.A. Steele, were jointly awarded the patent for the cathode ray detection finder. The CRDF was a navigation device that could be installed in an airplane's cockpit and constantly indicate the direction of a specific radio beacon. The reverse was also possible. The plane could emit a radio signal, and a CRDF on the ground could track its movement. It was the precursor to radar. The latter technology won out because it can track any object, while a CRDF can only track objects emitting radio signals. For 1927, Andy and his family, which now included his fifth and final child, Leslie, went again to England for another year-long course. It was the first ever course of the Imperial Defence College. 30 officers from across the British Empire presented to each other, toured military research labs, and played through simulated crisis scenarios, including a war with Japan. Andy lectured on Canadian autonomy. He stated that Canada would serve alongside Britain in future wars, but not under it. That ruffled some imperial feathers. While Andy was away, McBrien stepped down as the Chief of the General Staff and was replaced by Thacker, who I previously mentioned in connection with the Cape Breton mine strike. In the reshuffling, Andy was given a new position, head of Military District 11, encompassing British Columbia and the Yukon. Andy was charged with assessing and improving the spotty coastal defense system. It was important work because a war with Japan was considered the most likely threat to Canadian peace. But it was also pleasurable work. Andy adored being miles away from the nearest desk, scouting out sites for airfields and coastal guns all along the Pacific shoreline. And when he wasn't working, the fishing was excellent. Alas, after only 6 months of that easy life, Andy was called back to Ottawa to replace Thacker as the Chief of the General Staff. At just 41 years old, Andy was now a Major General and the military head of the Canadian Army. Andy enjoyed the good favor of the Prime Minister, who was, once again, Mackenzie King. He had a much more trying relationship with Colonel Ralston, the Minister of National Defence. They shared the responsibility for running a modern army on a shoestring budget, and they simply had incompatible priorities. Andy deemed it essential that Canada have a state-run munitions manufacturer. He wanted Canada to be able to supply its own guns and shells, relying neither on an allied nation that would satisfy its own demand first, or on private businesses that could demand high prices. Ralston didn't consider that important. Instead, he telephoned Andy at all hours of the night about different issues that Andy rated as trivialities. On paper, Andy was in the highest position of power he had ever occupied. But for the first time in his life, he felt powerless to effect any actual change. He drafted a letter of resignation, but held back for one reason. There was a general election coming, and perhaps Ralston would be out. In the intervening months, Andy put his passion into an electrical engineering project of sorts. He built Leslie an 8-room dollhouse with a working elevator, lights, and even a doll-sized amount of heat. The lampshades were made from seashells that they'd collected in BC. In the 1930 election, R.B. Bennett's Conservatives defeated Mackenzie King's Liberals. Crucially, that meant a new Minister of Defence, Donald Sutherland. The new government approved Andy's plans for a Canadian arsenal in Valcartier, Quebec. Things were looking up for Andy, and Andy was quite literally looking up. His Majesty's airship, the R-100, made a transatlantic crossing and arrived at Montreal. Andy and Mabel were among the special guests invited to board the majestic dirigible. Andy was invited to fly on with it to Toronto. There was a scary moment when they reached the city, where it looked like the ship might not clear the Bank of Commerce building, but it did. Overall, Andy had mixed feelings about dirigibles. He considered them finicky and flimsy compared to airplanes, but he had to concede that the view from the R-100, as they flew back over the St. Lawrence with the airship casting a rainbow shadow on the water, was beautiful. Months later, he was invited to go on the R-101's voyage to India, but had to decline because of other obligations. The flight he didn't go on ended in a fiery crash with 47 fatalities. Bennett assigned Andy to attend the 1930 Imperial Conference and to serve on the Committee on Constitutional Relations.
Mr. Robert Bennett, Prime Minister of Canada, on the left, heads the Canadian delegation.
Their work led to the Statute of Westminster and the Visiting Forces Act. Andy's view on Canadian autonomy, that he learned from Currie on the battlefields of France, became the law. Sailing back to Canada, Andy thought about transatlantic air travel. Britain had scrapped the airship program because of the crash of the R-101, so the future of transatlantic travel was undoubtedly planes. How, Andy wondered, could he ensure that planes flew from Canada via Newfoundland instead of from the United States via Bermuda and the Azores? He realized that it was a race. If he drummed up development and public enthusiasm for the northern route before the Americans did much in the south, Canada could secure a lasting advantage. To do that, he proposed that during the Imperial Economic Conference of 1932, Canada offered the delegates the fastest transatlantic mail service in history up to that point, using a combination of ships and planes. The first 5 letters to make the trip were from Andy to each of his children. The press hailed the achievement. Said the Montreal Gazette, 4 days from London, amazing cut-in time and ship-to-shore experiment. The impressed delegates signed an agreement. The governments of the United Kingdom, the Irish Free State, Canada, and Newfoundland would give preference to the route that included all 4 of them, and not actively support routes from other interests, meaning Pan American Airlines. During the conference, Andy had one additional task that he loathed. Bennett placed him in charge of the hospitality, issues like, as Andy put it, "Who should sit with Baldwin, Lady Borden?" Nothing could have been less interesting to the soldier-scientist. Mabel recalled, "You know, Andy, you were harder to live with at that time than I've ever known you." Andy attended another conference in 1932, but it was a disaster. The League of Nations World Disarmament Conference in Geneva.
No one doubts that disarmament is possible, but the common man wants to know whether the governments with great military, naval and air forces are really in earnest in their desire for peace.
The idea was that countries would disclose the size of their arsenals and then agree to reduce them. The opposite occurred. Hearing the size of the other countries' arsenals made most countries unwilling to dispose of a single shell. The discussion went in circles and was wholly unproductive. Andy wired Ottawa, requesting permission to come home early. It was granted, but too late. While he was away, the government made gutting cuts to the Air Force budget. Why the cuts? The Great Depression had arrived. By 1933, 783,000 Canadian men were out of work. Those who were single, homeless, and transient became a national security risk, both because of the crimes they might commit individually and because they could be recruited to the communist insurrectionist cause. Andy was a two-birds-with-one-stone thinker, as he had shown before when he addressed the problem of training aviators and signalers while simultaneously developing the Canadian North. He proposed to keep the homeless men out of trouble while employing them in genuinely useful work. An ancillary benefit to the military would be that the work camps could be run by Army officers, who would get practical training in managing large groups of men. Andy felt it was absolutely crucial that the men not be forced, and the work not be a drudgery. He wanted inspirational projects that the men would come to voluntarily and would give them a sense of purpose and hope. The scheme would also educate the men, with on-the-job training in technical skills and evening literacy classes from Frontier College. Andy proposed one project to remind the men of Canada's past, repairing the citadels at Quebec City and Halifax, and one project to get them dreaming of Canada's future, the construction of landing strips and aerodromes from coast to coast to complete the Trans-Canada Airway. He told the Prime Minister that he could run the program for $1 per day per man, 75 cents to cover the food and other camp needs, and 25 cents paid to the worker directly. Historians rank Andy's scheme as the most effective government project any country mounted during the Depression, better than Roosevelt's work relief program that it directly inspired, and better than the British attempt. The British Minister of Labour, Sir Arthur Steele Maitland, said, "I have a distrust of extemporized public works in times of depression, but the best public works I have ever seen have been executed in Canada, under a man whom I consider to be a genius, General McNaughton." One detractor claimed that men brought nothing with them into the camps and took nothing out. RMC student Guy Lefresne eloquently responded, "The men did bring something into the camps. They brought ill health, despair, a sense of uselessness. They also took something out with them. They took health, an improved education, hope for the future, and most important of all, their self-respect." As brightly as the scheme shines in retrospect, at the time it was the most divisive issue in Canadian politics. Trade unionists objected to the men being trained in technical work, which they felt should be reserved for members of the skilled trade unions. The opposition party, led by Andy's one-time champion Mackenzie King, attacked the camps as exploitative. The men's salary of 25 cents per day was less than minimum wage, ignoring the fact that food and accommodations were provided. King leapt into the 1935 election season with a promise to close the camps. R.B. Bennett, a teetotaler, called Andy into his office and told him, "Have a chocolate." As Andy chewed, Bennett explained that he couldn't win the election with Andy as the chief of the general staff. In all likelihood, he couldn't win the election at all. He wanted to find Andy a new role before the Liberals won, one that they would be content for him to stay in. The president of the National Research Council was due to retire, and Bennett figured that it was the perfect fit for a man with a scientific background and administrative chops. Andy accepted Bennett's reasoning and the position, but he was disappointed to step away from an army so emaciated by Depression-era cuts. He left behind a list of the 8 ways in which the army was most deficient, in hopes that the new CGS would find a way to address the need. Bennett did lose the election. When King took over, the committee he created to study the unemployment crisis found that the camps that he had so disparaged during the election were well run and quite simply necessary. King's only option to keep the program going without contradicting his earlier statements that they were exploitative was to announce that he would double the workers' pay. It was a pay increase his government couldn't afford, but wouldn't you know it, it would come into effect in the spring when the camps were already due to be phased out in favor of farm work. The men who went from Andy's camps to the farms soon found that the farms worked them longer and harder for less pay. Andy's appointment to the presidency of the National Research Council was initially extremely unpopular. The scientists expected a soldier to march all over their intellectual freedom. But then they met him. As the University of Saskatchewan's Jack Mackenzie put it, he had been a general, he had been in command, but when he moved into this organization, he didn't order people at all. He just operated the way all good research scientists operate. And so he never interfered with your liberty, and soon the people just worshipped him, and they loved to see him come around. Andy's approach to the National Research Council was to identify a specific scientific puzzle with real practical value, identify the scientist most likely to solve the problem, and then give that scientist all the lab space, equipment, and support they needed to make a strong attempt. For example, Andy knew that magnesium was the perfect lightweight metal for making airplanes, and that Canada had lots of the magnesium-rich mineral dolomite. The problem was that there was no practical method to extract magnesium from dolomite at scale. He deemed Lloyd Montgomery Pidgeon the scientist most likely to find a way. Pidgeon was up front with Andy that he didn't think it was possible, but he accepted the invitation to try. He succeeded, and the Pidgeon process that bears his name is still in use today. During Andy's relatively brief tenure as president of the NRC, its scientists made innovations in optics, anti-gas fabrics, and refrigerated railroad cars. Frederick Banting of insulin fame demystified the physiology behind aviators blacking out, work that ultimately led to William Franks inventing the G-suit. Andy and Banting were kindred spirits and remained close friends until Banting's early death. Andy championed the creation of the National Building Code. He also championed the NRC itself. He made impassioned speeches on the value of research that secured unprecedented funding. That paid for the state-of-the-art labs on Sussex Drive. Physicist L.E. Howlett considers the McNaughton years the turning point of the Council from a national organization to being part of science on a worldwide scale. They were also the most tranquil and happy years of Andy's life. That tranquility ended September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland. That very day, politician Herbert Harridge sent Andy a message that said, "Dear Tug, what can I do to help to immediately get you back into the place which belongs to you?" On September 10th, Canada officially declared war on Germany. On October 6th, Mackenzie King offered the command of the troops that would go overseas to Andy. They may have been on opposite sides of the aisle in 1935, but King knew he was the best man for the job. Andy was pleased to accept as long as the Prime Minister understood one thing: they would abide by Currie's dictum, and pay the cost of victory in shells, not lives. It would be Valenciennes, not the Somme. King agreed with the whole of his heart. Troops were recruited according to a mobilization plan that Andy himself had written in 1932. It emphasized drawing men from every province in proportion to their population, so that no one part of the country would suffer heavier losses than the rest. Andy embarked on an east-to-west tour, visiting all of the units and identifying issues. In Nova Scotia, he was impressed by the men's spirit, but shocked by their lack of basic supplies like underwear and blankets. In Toronto, he noticed too many fresh faces in the troops, and advised the Minister of Defense to immediately institute a minimum age of 18, which he did. In Borden, he found tanks and soldiers housed in the same buildings, and banned that practice as an unacceptable fire hazard. In Winnipeg, he spoke with the first troops to try the new uniforms. They confirmed that they were comfortable. Andy's most controversial declaration of the trip was that the Highland regiments would wear the uniform too, since kilts left too much skin exposed to chemical weapons. Midway through his cross-country trip, Andy took one afternoon to himself to visit Moosomin and stroll the streets of his boyhood town. Besides ensuring that the troops were kitted up and fit to fight, Andy prepared Canadian industry for the work ahead. The British War Office told Andy they wouldn't need Canadian vehicles, but he correctly predicted otherwise and urged Canadian automakers to expand production. Then he met with the Ontario Mining Association to explore how the latest diamond drilling technology could bring horizontal boring to the battlefield.
The jackhammers of Canadian miners are writing their own page in the history of the war. The diamond bit of the drill must be perfectly true to cut its way through rock. Each little diamond must be carefully set in place by skilled hands.
On December 10th, the first convoy of Canadians sailed for Scotland. Andy and about 7,000 of his troops were on the ocean liner Aquitania, which flew the Canadian battle flag.
The boys from Canada are with us again. It's the story of 1914 repeated in 1939. They have been convoyed safely across the Atlantic thanks to the vigilance of the British Navy. Mr. Anthony Eden is on the quayside to greet them. But there's nothing I can add to this scene. Let the voice of Canada speak for itself.
The press junket covering the event noted Andy's resemblance to the actor Charles Ruggles. Then he was aboard the night train to London, where it was straight to meetings with Chief of the Imperial General Staff Ironside and the First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill. At the Ministry of Supply, he argued about the Canadian and British roles in industrial mobilization with Maurice Taylor, the same man he had been injured with in the splinter bomb attack. The first 8 months of World War II is sometimes called the Phony War. The British and the Canadians were officially at war with Germany, but all was quiet on the Western Front. A British expeditionary force led by Viscount Gort was in France but saw little action. The Canadians were safe in England. Andy's task, outside of his endless meetings about supplies, was to keep the troops interested and usefully training through England's coldest winter in almost 50 years. On Christmas Eve, he at least got warm. Mabel arrived. Like in the previous war, she intended to be as close to her husband as the army allowed. Their children were mostly grown. Eldest Christina had gotten married at the beginning of the year. All three of the boys were in the military. Andrew was a test pilot in the RCAF. Teddy was part of Andy's force in England, an instructor in gunnery. Ian was a cadet at RMC. Baby Leslie was 15, a pupil at the Convent of the Sacred Heart, a Montreal boarding school. In January, Andy finally went to France, but without his army. He met with the BEF and the French army at the Maginot Line to determine what the Canadians could do. He concluded that the Maginot Line was not a defense at all, but a trap. What was needed was to take the fight to the Germans, with diamond drills, with long-range artillery firing air bursts, and with fighter jets and bombers. He headed back to England to restructure his army for the situation on the ground. On April 16th, Andy received a call from the War Office, urgently requesting 800 Canadians for a special operation, not in France, but in Norway. Germany had invaded Norway 1 week earlier. The Canadians were asked to seize the city of Trondheim, while the British secured its flanks. When Andy was satisfied that the reasoning behind the engagement and the plans for it were both sound, he committed 2 battalions. He deliberately chose troops from Western Canada because some of them would speak Norwegian. Andy had 2 days to equip them with tougher winter gear, and then they shipped north. Throughout those 2 days, he also had to contend with being reprimanded by Colonel Ralston. Recall that Ralston was the Minister of Defense at the beginning of Andy's turn as Chief of the General Staff, and that Andy almost quit over his leadership. Now, Ralston was the Minister of Finance, and Andy would not have had to deal with him, except that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense were both out of the country, and Ralston was executing the functions of both. Ralston claimed that Andy committing troops to Norway without permission from Ottawa, i.e. without permission from him, was an illegal overstep. As it happened, the British flanking attacks near Trondheim were more successful than anticipated. The War Office decided that the Canadian troops were not needed. They had only reached as far as Scotland and were sent back. The main consequence of the almost battle was the increased hostility between Andy and Ralston. When the returned troops joined their comrades, they were greeted with good-natured jeers. "Where's the reindeer you promised us?" Once again, the entire Canadian force had nothing to do. The Van Deus took a turn guarding Buckingham Palace, the first non-Anglophone troops to ever do so.
They're changing guard at Buckingham Palace. But today the ceremony that is already world famous is an historic occasion. For the King, in the uniform as Admiral of the Fleet, is welcoming the French Canadians of the Royal 22nd Regiment. Men whose mother tongue is French take over the guardianship of the royal family.
The thumb-twiddling quiet of the phony war ended on May 10th, when Germany suddenly invaded 3 neutral countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The Germans used hardly any infantry to subdue the Low Countries. Their tanks took the ground while their airplanes ruled the sky. They had 4 times as many planes as any army that tried to oppose them. Their planes dropped both bombs and elite paratroopers who subdued fortifications. The Germans quickly pierced the Maginot Line, which Andy had said wouldn't hold, and their tanks moved steadily toward the English Channel. If all that were not bad enough, intelligence reports suggested that Italy would soon declare war on the Allies. The British government did not think that Neville Chamberlain could handle the rising crisis. They made Winston Churchill Prime Minister. Churchill's War Office had 2 priorities. They wanted to assist the French army and the British Expeditionary Force in holding the portions of France that Germany had not yet captured. They also had to ready England for home defense, in case the Germans invaded there next. On the home front, the leader of the citizens' militia complained that there weren't enough guns to arm the flood of volunteers. That Andy could help with. Back when he was Chief of the General Staff, he'd ordered that all of the Ross rifles recalled from the Canadian forces in World War I be tuned up. They weren't suitable for trench warfare, but they were ideal for home defense. He arranged for them to be sent to England. As for France, at the request of the War Office, Andy sent a subset of the Canadian force to Dover to be ready to rapidly embark for either Calais or Dunkirk. An artillery regiment and a machine gun battalion would follow from Southampton. The choice between Calais and Dunkirk could not be made until the War Office had a clearer picture of the situation on the ground. Andy would be their eyes. At 9 p.m. on the 23rd, he and a small reconnaissance team boarded the destroyer HMS Verity, bound for Calais. His mission was to ascertain the strategic situation in both port cities, but he also carried written authorization to assume command of all Allied forces in northern France if the need arose. The Verity docked in Calais at 11:30 p.m. There were shells landing on the city intermittently, and some fires. Andy spoke with French and British officers there, but they had very little information to offer. They didn't know which towns the German army had occupied, and crucially, they didn't know if the road to Dunkirk was clear. A supply convoy was planned to depart Calais for Dunkirk at 2 a.m., but no one knew if it would arrive. Andy could reach Dunkirk faster traveling by sea, and then ascertain the state of the road based on whether or not the convoy arrived. Andy couldn't call Dover or Dunkirk from Calais because the telephone line passed through forts that were now in German hands. He did send a report to the War Office through the Navy, but the time required for it to be encoded and then decoded on the other end meant a latency of over 3 hours. At 1:20, Andy and his team reboarded the Verity. German airplanes shot at the ship repeatedly as they left Calais, and then again as they arrived in Dunkirk. Andy recalled shells raining on all sides, everywhere except a direct hit. In Dunkirk, Andy met officers who were much better informed than their counterparts in Calais. They explained that the Germans had captured almost all of the supply lines to the BEF, who were now facing an ammunition shortage. There were German tanks on the Saint-Omer road, with some reports that they had reached Gravelines. 2 French divisions were marching toward Dunkirk and might suffice to hold it. Andy became convinced that the Canadians were needed at Calais. At 6 a.m., Andy finally learned what had befallen the convoy. They encountered German guns at Marques. The bridge there was damaged by a mine, but still passable. 3 of the Allied tanks had made it through and were guarding the road to Dunkirk. The rest of the convoy returned to Calais. At 9 a.m., French General Fajald arrived from Bruges and offhandedly mentioned one new piece of information that hit Andy like a sack of bricks. One of the 2 French divisions coming to defend Dunkirk had left the front line near Bruges to do so. It seemed obvious to Andy that unless the gap they'd left in the line was sewn up quickly, it wouldn't matter if they held off the attack from the south. Dunkirk would be overrun by a larger force coming from the east. Andy needed to get that information to the War Office, and there was no time to wait for the encoding and decoding process. He and his team loaded onto a ship's boat and met the Verity at sea. They landed in Dover at 1 p.m. Andy shaved on the car ride to London. There he met with all the top brass, including eventually Churchill. Andy gave his report. Churchill agreed that holding Calais was crucial, and perhaps the Canadians should be sent there. On the other hand, their presence in Dover was currently England's best defense against a German attack. Andy laid his head in his hands and got some sleep. Ultimately, the Canadian force was not sent to either French city, and the Germans took both. The only slimmer of good news was that the Allied resistance at Calais delayed the German attack on Dunkirk long enough for the BEF to evacuate.
Out from the hell that is Dunkirk, back from the steel thrust of the German war machine comes the BEF.
While all of that was happening, Andy and the Canadians were tasked with defending Britain. A German invasion could occur anywhere on the southern coast, and the Canadian force would need to respond. Andy spent 3 days in reconnaissance of the entire coastline, noting the potential landing fields and the barriers to rapid troop movement. The worst barriers were the walls of sandbags that the British had placed on the road so that German airplanes couldn't use them as landing strips. The sandbags were laid out from the left or right side of the road to the middle in an alternating pattern, so that local traffic could zigzag through. It was a neat design, but it would slow the movement of troops and large military vehicles to a useless crawl. Off the top of his head, Andy suggested an alternative that would stop an airplane but not an army, stringing wire cables across the road high enough for troops to pass under. His idea worked. The British government went on to spend £10 million on anti-aircraft tripwires all over England, and they caught some planes. On June 5th, Andy received new orders. The French army looked poised to give in to Germany. Churchill believed that he could buoy their fighting spirit by sending a new British expeditionary force there, led by Lieutenant General Alan Brooke. The Canadians were asked to be a part of it. Andy and Brooke decided that the 1st Canadian Division, under the command of Armand Smith, could sail to France with Brooke, while Andy remained in England, readying the rest of the Canadian force to follow. Brooke stated that his group would wait in Brest until Andy arrived. While that was happening, Andy got tragic news from Canada. The Canadian Minister of Defence, Norman Rogers, had died in a plane crash. The unfortunate consequence for Andy was that Colonel Ralston took over the portfolio. Andy's nemesis was once again his boss. On June 13th, Smith arrived in Brest, where he was given orders he didn't expect. Counter to the plan of waiting there, and utterly unbeknownst to Andy, his troops were ordered to travel east to Le Mans by train, without their vehicles. Andy was at Plymouth, ready to embark for France with the Toronto Scottish Regiment, when new orders came down. It had become clear that the remnants of the French army would sign an armistice with Germany. The 2nd BEF should come home. When Andy looked back on the ordeal with hindsight, he conceded that it was all a chimera. We were moving into France to reinforce an army that didn't exist, and there wasn't the remotest chance of one being created. There weren't in the whole of France, informed bodies, any troops to constitute an army. This is a really shocking state of affairs because the information that we were operating on had come primarily from Churchill himself, and must have been based on wishful thinking or something of that sort. Everybody on our side was misled. Because the Canadians were scattered around Le Mans, and not concentrated in Brest as they were expected to be, it took 2 days for them to receive the order and return to the coast. The officers managing the departure believed that it had to be done quickly. They judged that there was neither time nor space to load most of the guns or the vehicles, and ordered that they be destroyed rather than left for the enemy. J.H. Roberts of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery earned Andy's lasting gratitude by doggedly getting his regiment's guns loaded on a boat. Roberts, incidentally, was born very close to Moosomin in Pipestone, Manitoba. 216 Canadian vehicles were needlessly destroyed in the hasty departure from Brest. The Germans didn't arrive for another day and a half. Worst of all, when every head was counted back in England, 6 Canadians were unaccounted for. 2 of them may have died in a motorcycle accident. The others were taken prisoner by the German army. One of them, Fraser Hutchinson, went on to escape a labor camp and do something for the French resistance that won him the military medal, but the details were kept secret and remain unknown. Andy did not trust Brooke again after the Brittany business. It had reinforced the lesson of World War I. British officers could not be trusted with Canadian troops. But what about a Canadian officer commanding British troops? That uncommon arrangement came to pass by the end of June. Faced with the imminent threat of invasion, the most capable forces in Britain were divided into 2 rapid response defense teams. 4 corps would protect the territory north of the Thames, while 7 corps protected everything south of it. 7 corps would be commanded by Andy, and include the 1st Canadian Division, the 1st Armoured British Division, and 2 brigades of the 2nd New Zealand Division. For the following summer, Andy's corps slept dispersed under trees in parks, close to their vehicles. Barracks would have been bombed, and billeting in homes would have compromised the corps' ability to be on the move at a moment's notice. Andy kept them rehearsing for an invasion. They practiced moving far, moving fast, and moving in the dark. Andy was characteristically determined to bring the latest scientific advancements to the new corps. He consulted with the best minds in the Empire on increasing the ranges of long-distance weapons and using magnetometers to locate unexploded bombs. Fearing chemical warfare, he prompted the invention of a mobile laboratory for testing the type and volume of gases in the field, as well as the founding of a military research facility in Suffield, Alberta that still exists. He also made use of the 1st Canadian Tunneling Company he had personally recruited. The British had been tearing up their own airfields so they couldn't be used by the enemy. Andy had the drillers bury explosives underneath fields so they could be destroyed at a moment's notice if the enemy was coming, but could otherwise be preserved. Andy also made a great innovation in airburst ranging, the artillery method he began experimenting with in World War I, in which shells are timed to explode in the air just above a distant target. The range of error for British airbursts was intolerably high until Andy drew the McNaughton graph, a user-friendly graphic that replaced a cumbersome system of reference tables and arithmetic. The summer passed, and a land invasion did not materialize. Instead, Germany harassed the British citizenry from the air. Andy was only about 100 meters away when a cottage was hit, killing 1 adult and at least 2 children. Many British children were evacuated to Canada and elsewhere to keep them safe. But that plan ended when a U-boat sank one of the ships and 77 children drowned.
Surely the world could have no clearer proof of the wickedness against which we fight than this foul deed.
On September 7th, Germany switched from distributed attacks on port towns to the concentrated bombing of London known as the Blitz. With the change of season, a land invasion became unlikely, and 7 Corps no longer needed to be drilling rapid troop movements. Andy allowed them to settle into comparatively cozy dugout huts. He decided on a program of educational training to maintain their resolve during what would probably be another cold and quiet winter.
The latest arrival of Canadians brought thousands more to swell the ranks of the still growing army.
More Canadians arrived in England and formed the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Andy urged Ottawa to slow down the influx of volunteers because equipment wasn't arriving at the same rate. There was little value and considerable cost to housing and feeding a lot of ill-equipped soldiers through a winter in which he was not expecting to engage the enemy. The new arrivals did have one marvelous consequence, however. On Christmas Day, 7 Corps was renamed and restructured as the Canadian Corps, a rebirth of the army that Currie had led in World War I. One witness recalled that Andy was in high spirits, as cheerful as the season. He doesn't smile a great deal, but that morning he was literally beaming. Like Currie, Andy was determined that the Canadian Corps be autonomous and always together as one. When that principle was ignored in a large-scale training exercise, Andy wrote a firm letter to Brooke, then the commander-in-chief of the home defense effort, insisting that no such situation should arise in actual operations. While commanding the Canadian Corps, Andy continued, as always, to invent. He designed a magnifying flashlight that diffused light downward so officers could read maps at night without being spotted by airplanes. And he took an active advisory role in the development of carrier flamethrowers called Ronsons. Andy lived in a fixer-upper, and one observer wrote of him, "The more appliances that go wrong in his home, the happier he is." House repairs were the main form of relaxation that he allowed himself. He kept a fishing rod in his car in case there was a lazy afternoon, but there never was. One aide-de-camp described his pace of work as talking manpower with one brigadier, switching to a discussion of armored vehicles with another, 20 minutes later debating the merits of a new sound ranging method with a gunner officer, all day, every day. And in that fashion, 1941 passed much like 1940, with the Canadian Corps engaged only in the home defense of Britain. There were two exceptions. In August, 500 of Andy's men collaborated with the Navy on a surprise operation on the island of Spitsbergen in the Arctic Ocean. They destroyed wireless stations and coal reserves important to the German war effort. Because the operation was kept top secret, Andy was one of only a handful of officers who knew it was going to happen. They did so unopposed.
Every man eagerly hoped for a scrap with the Nazis, but no Germans were on the island. Although disappointed in this respect, they had the satisfaction of performing work which robs the Nazis of a valuable source of coal supply. When the time comes, the entire population of some 700 inhabitants and about 1,900 Russian miners, who work the pits under a Norwegian concession, set about the evacuation of the island. New homes in Britain await these hardy folk, now leaving their Arctic homes for hospitable shores 1,400 miles away.
In December, a little over 2 years after Canada declared war, Canadian soldiers fired on an enemy on land for the first time. But the enemy wasn't German, and the battle occurred 6,000 miles away from Andy. On the same day that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, prompting the United States to enter the war, Japan also attacked Hong Kong, then a British colony. The garrison stationed in Hong Kong included 2 Canadian regiments who had only arrived the previous month.
The Canadians fought tenaciously, but they were undertrained, without necessary equipment, and short of water and ammunition. 290 Canadians died in the fall of Hong Kong, but what followed was worse.
Some of the wounded were murdered. The hundreds of men who became prisoners of war suffered brutal treatment. 264 of them died in captivity. The battle ended on Christmas Day with the Allied forces surrendering the city to Japan. Andy and Mabel began 1942 with an extended trip to Canada. Andy went to tour munitions factories and research labs, but Mackenzie King also needed him home for a more political reason. In a repeat of 1917, Canadians were bitterly divided over conscription. Mackenzie King wanted to tread a middle path between the pro-conscription and anti-conscription factions by adopting the motto, not necessarily conscription, but conscription if necessary. He needed Canada's most famous soldier to publicly articulate that he preferred his soldiers to be volunteers, and that there was no military justification for conscription at this time. However, everyone should vote yes on a plebiscite that would free King to introduce conscription in the future if the military situation drastically changed. Andy agreed with Mackenzie King's position on conscription and was pleased to comply. Andy was not just Canada's most famous soldier. He was quickly becoming one of its most famous celebrities. All of the nation's magazines had his face on the cover with glowing profiles inside. He always attempted to direct the attention away from himself and onto the Canadian Corps as a whole, but that only increased his appeal. One profile described him as a man who forgot about himself so long ago he probably doesn't even see himself when he is shaving. In his most famous interview, Andy described the Canadian force as a dagger pointed at the heart of Berlin, a turn of phrase that delighted the public and was forever associated with the general. During Andy's visit in Canada, crowds swarmed him like he was a movie star, trying to touch his clothes. Now that the United States had entered the war, a U.S. advertising company conducted a market research study on the various patriotic posters Canada was using to sell war bonds, to know which styles to emulate. Of all the Canadian posters they tested, the one that ranked highest was this portrait of Andy. The respondents' comments included, "I like the strength behind it, that's what McNaughton stands for, strength." And, "He looks so serious and worried, he makes you feel no sacrifice is too great." and "You just have to support him, a man like that." Some of Andy's fans wanted him to take a larger role in Canadian politics. The Conservative Party approached him to become their leader and run against Mackenzie King, but that he wouldn't consider. A privately funded campaign ran full-page ads in the newspaper suggesting he run the domestic war effort. Mackenzie King did ask him about that option, but had a rather different task in mind for him: the creation of a Canadian army. That may seem like a strange statement, because of course Canada already had an army, in the colloquial sense of the word, the land-based component of the military as opposed to an air force or navy. But it didn't have one in the taxonomic sense of a unit larger than a corps and consisting of multiple corps. That would now change. The single Canadian Corps would become the 1st Canadian Corps, commanded by Harry Crerar. A 2nd Canadian Corps would be created and commanded by Ernest Sansom. Andy would oversee both, earning the nickname the Father of the Canadian Army. Toward the end of his visit to Canada, Andy attended a luncheon where he happened to meet Lachlan Curry, an economist who was born in Canada but served as an advisor to FDR. Curry was totally taken with Andy and told the U.S. president that he should meet him. When Andy received an invitation to the White House, everyone asked him what the president wanted to talk to him about. Andy was bewildered, but his best guess was the chemical warfare research being conducted at Suffield. To his surprise, FDR wanted to discuss the global war as a whole. Did Andy think that a bombing campaign against German cities would erode the enemy's morale? No. Berliners would learn to live with the bombs, to keep calm and carry on just like the Londoners did. At FDR's urging, Andy then met with Dwight D. Eisenhower. What did Andy think about a ground invasion in France? It would be the best chance against Hitler, but the first hurdle would be the mass production of landing craft. That became the top priority for Andy, and by June, Canada was making 400 landing craft per month. Andy and Mabel returned to England on March 28th, and Andy set about establishing the Canadian Army. Having observed the British Army for decades, Andy wanted the Canadian version to be different in one important way. In the British Army, officers attracted lackeys and sycophants who expected promotions when the man they were loyal to was promoted. In the Canadian Army, promotion would proceed on a scientific basis with extensive use of psychological testing. Efficiency would be the hallmark of the Canadian Army, which they proved when they built the Dunsfold Aerodrome and proudly presented it to the RCAF.
In May 1942, the Army's bulldozers started clearing ground for a new airport for the RCAF. It was a mammoth job, and it had to be done quickly. One of the chief obstacles to the expansion of the Canadian Army's vital air component was the shortage of aerodromes. So General McNaughton set the Royal Canadian Engineers to work. To help the sappers came detachments from the Forestry Corps, the Ordnance Corps, and drivers from the RCASC. Heavy Canadian and American equipment was kept working 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, and there was no time off for tea. 5 short months after work was started, the Army had done its job in record time. The huge aerodrome was ready to be formally handed over to the RCAF. Chief figures in this ceremony included Air Chief Marshal Courtney, Air Marshal Edwards, Major General Hertzberg, the Army's Chief Engineer, and Lieutenant General McNaughton.
I'm very happy to be here today and to acknowledge also, as General Hertzberg has done, the very wonderful cooperation in this whole matter which has been extended to us by the Air Ministry and all those who work in that ministry under the direction of Air Chief Marshal Courtney.
Air Marshal Edwards, accepting the aerodrome on behalf of the RCAF, declared it one of the finest in England and a magnificent achievement. Meanwhile, 12 Mustangs were circling the field in tight formation, and as they landed on the smooth, wide runways, they symbolized the striking cooperation between the Canadian Army and the RCAF.
In April, the ammunition development team found an ingenious solution to a problem that Andy had been thinking about for years. The Allies needed a way to increase the velocity with which shells exited field guns so that they could penetrate German tanks. The solution was to encase a small shell in a light metal or plastic wrapper called a shoe, so that it could fit in the barrel of a gun designed for a much larger caliber shell. At the muzzle, the shoe would be blown off by powder, while the small projectile continued through the air much faster than it would have shot from a gun of its own size. Andy didn't claim sole credit for the innovation, but others on the team remembered it as largely his idea. On April 30th, Bernard Montgomery informed Andy about Operation Rudder, a planned raid on Dieppe. It was intended to be an in-and-out engagement, somewhat similar to the destruction of the coal reserves on the island of Spitsbergen, but on a much larger scale. Over 6,000 infantrymen would put to shore in landing craft. They would establish a perimeter around the town of Dieppe and hold it for a short time. They would demolish a few coastal installations, gather intelligence, and then retreat. It would test the landing equipment and strategy in preparation for future amphibious assaults. Could the Canadian Army do the job? Andy judged that the plan was sound. He sought and received permission from Ottawa to volunteer Canadian troops. He and Harry Crerar, commander of the 1st Canadian Corps, chose its 2nd Division for the mission. In May, the division shipped to the Isle of Wight to prepare for the raid, which was set for July 8th. On June 21st, the Allied forces in Libya surrendered the city of Tobruk to the Axis powers. It was a devastating loss. For Andy, though, it was eclipsed by a much more personal loss the following night. Ian McNaughton, Andy and Mabel's 22-year-old middle child, was killed in action. Ian was a pilot and squadron leader who flew Lancaster bombers over Germany. He and the rest of his 7-person crew were en route to bomb the town of Emden when they were shot down by a German Navy anti-aircraft battalion. Only a week later, Andy found himself in the British papers in connection with a political coup that he wanted no part of. A faction of British politicians considered Tobruk proof that Churchill was overtaxed, being both Prime Minister and Defence Minister. They gave speeches in Parliament pressuring him to give up the latter role. The Daily Mail's correspondent predicted that he would, and that the job of Defence Minister would fall to Andy, even though the anti-Churchill faction hadn't raised his name. Although the vote of censure called by Churchill's detractors was soundly defeated, Churchill took a lesson from the debacle, namely that he should add some strategic heavyweights to his staff. On July 9th, Churchill's team approached Andy to see if he would join the British government as the head of technical development for the armed services. Andy explained that his loyalty was to Canada. No job offer would pry him away from the Canadian Army. The very same day, Churchill presented another task to Andy, one that wouldn't necessitate a change of job, but would squeeze him right between a rock and a hard place. Churchill and his chiefs of staff were deadlocked over a plan to invade Norway and Finland, codenamed Operation Jupiter. Churchill wanted to do it, but his chiefs of staff thought it was a terrible plan. Churchill wouldn't take no for an answer and proposed that Operation Jupiter be subject to an impartial third-party review. Deputy Prime Minister Clement Attlee suggested Andy as someone who would deliver an objective analysis, rather than shape his findings to try to curry favor with the Prime Minister or the chiefs. Andy accepted the task and brought in another cool head he trusted, Staff Officer Guy Simmons. While Andy and Simmons were considering Operation Jupiter, July 8th came and went. Unfavorable weather forced the War Office to postpone Operation Rudder. The raid on Dieppe would now occur in August and be called Operation Jubilee. Reviving a cancelled battle plan is dangerous, though. Loose lips sink ships. Andy found out about the change later than he should have. Increasingly, he found himself left out of important conversations. Andy submitted his Operation Jupiter report on August 6th. He concurred with the chiefs of staff. The mission had some possibility of success, but a higher chance of being a military disaster of the first order. On August 19th, just such a military disaster occurred at Dieppe.
More than 200 Allied ships and landing craft closed in on the port city and the beaches east and west of Dieppe. 6,000 troops stormed the beaches. More than 80% of them were Canadian. But from the cliff tops, the enemy could see the full length of each beach and every soldier and tank crossing it. Many of the Canadian tanks stalled in the small round beach stones that jammed in their tracks, and so trapped on the beach, soldiers were caught in a deadly crossfire from the German machine guns. Canadian casualties totaled 3,367, including 907 dead and 1,874 men captured. It was the Canadian Army's costliest day of the war.
The Canadian newspapers reported that the Dieppe raid had been a triumph that fulfilled all of its objectives. Only when the casualty lists were printed did the public realize the truth. Andy traveled to Portsmouth to greet the returning troops and hear their account of the carnage. 3 days later, he stood in a cemetery as 40 soldiers were laid to rest who had returned from Dieppe only to die of their injuries. He'd approved the mission, and they had paid the price. But Andy had to think about the next mission. He had expected it would be the big one, a full-scale amphibious invasion of France, codenamed Operation Roundup. On September 19th, Churchill had a long meeting with Andy, in which he tried every method from flattery to lying to a joking threat to a thinly veiled bribe to persuade Andy that the Canadians should undertake Operation Jupiter, while the Britons and Americans did an action in North Africa codenamed Operation Torch. First, the flattery. Andy's excellent report on Operation Jupiter had been so thorough in pointing out its flaws that only he could correct the issues and make it a great mission. Then the lie. Had Andy heard about a new tactic for aircraft carriers that the British had just used in Malta, which would render many of Andy's objections to Jupiter moot? No, he hadn't, but he would look into it. The joking threat, as recorded in Sweetenham, seems too cinematic to have actually occurred, but perhaps something like it did. Sweetenham has it that the two men were arguing back and forth for a while, when Churchill paused, looked at Andy over his glasses and said, "You know, sometimes I envy Stalin. He can shoot people who disagree with him." And Andy retorted, "Ah, but democracy has its advantages too. A leader can step down without getting shot." The thinly veiled bribe involved Stalin too. Andy's Jupiter report mentioned that actions in Norway should only be undertaken in collaboration with the USSR. Wouldn't Andy be just the man to visit Moscow and discuss it? That was tempting. Andy didn't say so to Churchill, but he, quote, would have given his eye teeth to go. After their discussion, Andy checked on Churchill's claims about the aircraft carrier strategy that the Britons had used in Malta. Sir Dudley Pound informed him that, in fact, the events in Malta confirmed rather than cancelled Andy's objections to Operation Jupiter. If Andy had allowed himself to be persuaded by Churchill without first checking with Pound, he might well have sent more Canadians to die by the hundreds in a second Dieppe. From that day forward, Andy did not trust Churchill. As 1943 began, everyone on the Allied side hoped it would be the year that they finally broke into Hitler's fortress Europe. Andy asked the architects of the invasion plans to specify what Canada's role would be so that he could restructure and equip his army for that purpose. Throughout January, their answer kept changing, however, forcing Andy to keep changing what supplies he requested of Ottawa. March brought Exercise Spartan, a giant war game that simulated an invasion of Europe. It included all of the corps who served in the Southeastern Command under General Paget. The Canadians played the part of the Allied forces, while the British played the Germans. It was the first chance for Sansom's Green 2nd Canadian Corps to participate in a large maneuver alongside Crewer's seasoned 1st Canadian Corps. Andy made strategic mistakes during the war game that caused the British brass to question his suitability for command. Predictably, the 2nd Canadian Corps made errors too. General Paget asked Andy to replace Sansom as a result, but Andy refused, confident that all involved had learned from the experience. The British weather was uncharacteristically dry during Operation Spartan, and the army kicked up a tremendous amount of dust. Andy realized that dust might be a problem in the real invasion, especially at airstrips. Just like in his National Research Council days, he hired the right scientists to find a solution. The result was prefabricated bituminous surfacing, or PBS. It proved perfect for quickly laying runways and sealing filled-in bomb craters.
When the runways have been leveled off, the most important operation begins. Rolls of bitumen surfacing are loaded aboard the layer. The invention of a Canadian captain, the layer cuts the time of surfacing to a low value. You just roll the surfacing out like a carpet, press it into shape, and there you are.
By April, the hope that 1943 would be the year of the invasion dwindled. The morale and fighting strength of the German army was just too strong. The Canadian army had been kept together in England since its inception, so that it would be together when D-Day came. Now the request came down for a portion of it to fight in Operation Husky, an invasion of Sicily. Andy was reluctant to break up his army, and wanted to be certain that Canadians weren't committed to Sicily merely as a public relations move, to satisfy a Canadian public that was weary of its troops seeing so little action. Eventually, however, he conceded that the Operation Husky battle plan was sound. Andy approved sending Canadians to Sicily on the basis of one assurance: the troops would fight in only that one engagement, and would return in plenty of time to participate in the invasion of Normandy, which was envisioned to be about a year away. The infantry division Andy chose for Sicily was the 1st Division under Harry Salmon. On April 29th, however, Salmon died in a plane crash en route to a Husky planning meeting in Egypt. Andy chose Guy Simonds to replace him.
Part of the final training undertaken by the 1st Division prior to its departure for Sicily was in hill climbing to prepare themselves for the rugged country that lay ahead. And though the going was tough, there wasn't a grumble to be heard, for this was the dress rehearsal for the big show.
What followed next was a chain of events that ultimately resulted in Andy being removed from his post. He had personal differences with Canada's Minister of Defence, Colonel Ralston, Canada's Chief of the General Staff, Kenneth Stewart, and Britain's Chief of the Imperial Staff, Alan Brooke, that had been brewing on a low boil for years. Ultimately, though, it came down to philosophical differences on the future of war and Canada's role in it. Andy, as we have seen, had two priorities. First, he wanted the Canadian Army to function autonomously, which realistically depended on both of its corps fighting on the same front. Second, he wanted the Canadian Army to participate in the amphibious invasion of France, the strategy favored by FDR. The British brass were increasingly focused on coming at Hitler from the south. It's unsurprising that the British Brooke was content to fold Canadian divisions into the British Army to fight in Italy. It's stranger that Ralston and Stuart were willing to break up the nascent Canadian Army in that way. Their priority was getting Canadians into battles, to silence the voices in Canada who felt we were sitting out the war.
For at long last, Canadian troops were to go into action, and it had fallen to the lot of the 1st Division to lead the way, to lead after waiting for over 3 years.
The first definite sign that Andy was being squeezed out occurred on July 15th. He had traveled to the Mediterranean theater and reached Malta, when he was informed that he would not be permitted to visit the Canadian troops in Sicily. Field Marshal Montgomery had made the decision so that Simmons and the 1st Canadian Division could find their feet without interference from on high. But Andy was told the transparently false reason that there was no transportation available to accommodate him. Andy took the refusal not as a personal affront, but as an issue of Canadian sovereignty. Montgomery did not have the authority to block the leader of another nation's army from visiting his own troops. When he returned to England, Andy was faced with Ralston and the British brass suggesting that the Canadian deployment in Italy be increased, both in terms of manpower up to an entire corps, and in terms of duration, extending beyond Sicily to a long-term campaign on the Italian mainland. Andy considered all Allied action in Italy counterproductive. The terrain favored defense, so battles there would involve many more Allied troops than German ones. That would hand the Germans the numbers advantage in France. Even so, Andy's general opposition to the campaign was not as intense as his opposition to Canadians specifically fighting in it. That would have the effect of dissolving the Canadian Army that he had worked so hard to create. Brooke put it bluntly. The superstructure would not be worthwhile if the Canadians were in 2 theaters. On July 25th, the King of Italy replaced Mussolini with Badoglio. Badoglio was just as much of a fascist as Mussolini, but he was willing to sign an armistice with the Allies and fight against the Germans. From August 14th to the 24th, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Mackenzie King met in Quebec to discuss the new strategic situation. Brooke was present and had one additional item on his agenda, convincing Mackenzie King to remove Andy. Sprinkling sugar into his poison, Brooke praised Andy's genius for innovation to Mackenzie King and suggested that he would be so much better suited to a research post than command in the field. Harry Crerar, now there was a man to lead an army. The Prime Minister was persuaded. He wrote that, quite apart from any differences between Ralston and himself, and incompatibility between the temper of the 2 men, there may be a necessity for someone else having command of the operations on the continent. It is really too bad, as the army is really due to MacNaughton, and he has lived in hope of commanding it in action. I can understand, however, how 4 years of service with health not too good may have affected his judgment. Ralston sent a message from Quebec directing Andy that the Canadian mission in Italy would continue on the mainland. Andy resigned himself to that reality and committed himself to the mission's success. In his words, "In the evolution of military force and in formulating plans we seek a clash of wits. But once a decision is reached, all controversy ceases, and that decision is supported with the whole heart and energy of everybody." In late August, Andy was finally permitted to go to Sicily and see the troops. One gunner recalled, "I remember his tropical uniform being something less well-tailored than those of the other senior officers who were perhaps more conscious of their image. He seemed actually respectful to the troops, unusual among commanders that we saw. He looked as though he really wanted to get up to an observation post and stay with us." Among all those I knew in the gunners, there was, I think, a unanimous conviction that Andy McNaughton was an officer and a gentleman from the inside out, and that he could be depended upon to do the right thing, without posturing. Alas, that was the last time those troops would encounter Andy as the head of their army. On September 3rd, Montgomery crossed to the Italian mainland with the Canadians in tow. They fired off a sizable amount of artillery to no purpose. The German army had left the area. On October 7th, it became official that more Canadians would go to Italy to relieve 4 British divisions who would head home. Andy was broken-hearted, but dutifully nominated the 1st Corps under Crerar and the 5th Armoured Division. The supreme Allied commander in Europe, Dwight D. Eisenhower, did not actually require the troops at the moment. Indeed, when they arrived on November 8th, they were given little to do and nothing to do it with. The Signal Corps had no radio sets, and the artillery regiments worked as stevedores. Back in England, General Paget told Andy that the remnants of the Canadian Army still stationed there would be supplemented by British soldiers to constitute a mixed corps, the 12th British Corps, that Andy would continue to command through to the Normandy invasion. Andy would be required to replace half of his Canadian staff with British officers to reflect the makeup of his troops. Andy could have been content enough with 12 Corps until D-Day. Ralston, though, was not content. In early November, he traveled to England. There are 2 contradictory accounts of Ralston's visit to England. Ralston contended that Brooke and Paget had already deemed Andy incapable of command, and that he simply communicated that with Andy. Andy believed that Brooke and Paget did not question his leadership until Ralston arrived and manipulated them into doing so. On November 10th, Andy sent a message to Mackenzie King, combining an offer of resignation with a passionate indictment of Ralston's conduct. The situation we have to face is that a minister of the Crown comes here and by suggestions and suppositions casts doubts in the minds of senior officers of another country with whom I have to work as to my fitness, then takes their silence or partial replies as assent to the view he has implied. I regard Ralston's action as one of the meanest and most despicable of my whole experience. Mackenzie King worried that the Canadian public would see Andy as a martyr who resigned because the Canadian government let their allies steal their army. He set out to smooth the situation. Paget, whether truthfully or because of arm twisting, sent a letter to Andy stating that he had not been manipulated by Ralston and had independently assessed Andy as unfit for command. He stated, "You have had 4 strenuous years in command, and in addition a great deal else to do which is outside the sphere of an army commander, and the strain has told on you. Also, your enthusiasm and ability in research and development work has led to your becoming too much absorbed on the technical side, at the expense of training and command." Andy believed it was poppycock. Even so, he would not damage the reputation of the Canadian government on his way out. Andy assured Mackenzie King that he would go with grace. Mackenzie King wished Andy's departure to be publicly attributed to his health. Andy dutifully submitted to a medical examination that found him below par. On the 27th, he issued a farewell message to all ranks. It read in part, "Thank you for the confidence and for the cheerfulness with which you have accepted all tasks as they arose, for the energy and the determination you have given to their discharge, and for the patience and discipline with which you have borne the many changes and disappointments of the last 4 hard years. I pray there will come, and early, a triumphant end to this present strife, and that soon you may return once more to Canada, your kith and kin. May divine Providence bless you, one and all." The next day, Andy officially turned over the command to Stuart, who, in a final touch of irony, was too sick to attend the ceremony. When Andy and Mabel left their English home to return to Canada, thousands of soldiers lined their route for 1.5 miles in a spontaneous show of affection. Andy got out of the car and shook hands the whole way. Mabel followed in the car and heard the soldiers shout to her, "Mom, bring him back to us soon!" Officially, after all, Andy was only granted 3 months' leave. He knew, though, that he would never return while Ralston was Minister of Defence.
December 1939. To a British port comes Lieutenant General A.G.L. McNaughton, in command of Canada's 1st Division. He and his staff, full realizing the heavy responsibility they've been given, work tirelessly, making Canadians a formidable striking force. No detail escapes his attention. No suggested idea or type of training goes unheeded. Week after month after year, the Canadian force, under the General's direction, is built up from a division to a corps, and then to a 2-corps army. Sicily, 1943. Canada's 1st Division receives its baptism of fire, and General McNaughton, once called the founder of the Canadian Army of this war, now sees the result of his early plans and training. Talking to officers and men, he gives them that feeling of confidence and faith in ultimate victory, that firm grip of leadership that held them steady in those twilight days of 1940, those grim days when the Canadians were among the few trained, organized troops standing between Hitler and his goal. News that the chief is stepping down is received by the Canadian Army with deep and sincere regret, for they are not only losing a great leader, but a good friend. Good luck and a well-earned rest, General McNaughton.
The McNaughtons chose to begin their life back in Canada with a holiday in rural Quebec. The press found them. When a reporter asked after his health, Andy took a breath of the crisp winter air, looked out over the rugged wilderness, and replied that he had never felt better in his life. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. The press speculated that Andy had been removed because of a falling out with Mackenzie King, and the story of his ill health was a fabrication. Andy cooperated with Mackenzie King's efforts to put that speculation to bed.
They dined together and smiled for the cameras.
Behind closed doors, Mackenzie King revealed a full account of Andy's removal to the leaders of the opposition parties. They saw that if the details came to light, the public would side with Andy, not Ralston, which would hurt the morale of the troops. Everyone agreed to make no statements on the matter and let the controversy fade with time.
Andy, for his part, was consumed by correspondence. He received letters of well wishes from politicians and generals, and, dearest to his heart, from individual Canadian soldiers in England and Italy. He replied to every one. In May, Andy traveled west to receive an honorary degree from the University of Saskatchewan. Every prairie town he passed through greeted him with crowds, flags, and marching bands.
In Moosomin, a public holiday was declared, so every citizen could see Andy at an open-air event. Then he and 300 guests dined at the old Opera House. At the reception, the chairman of the Victory Loan Committee announced that Moosomin residents had bought over $1 million worth of Victory loans, exceeding the fundraising target by more than 50%. The best part of a contemporary news article covering the event described Andy meeting with childhood friends and remembering the mischief they got up to.
It was with those people that the conversation got around to boyhood days and times, of how they put the potato in a homemade cannon that time and blew it over the elevator. It made such a noise the town thought the Indians were attacking. Of the time young McNaughton settled a political argument between his father and an uncle by setting off a charge of powder outside the sitting room window. Of the time he impersonated his father's voice in a long-distance call to Winnipeg and got the CPR to stop a transcontinental train near Mortlach so he and some friends could get off and go shooting.
On June 6th, the Normandy landings finally began. Shortly after, the Maple Leaf newspaper published an anonymous poem called Letter to Andy. The battle's far from over, but we're keen to play our part. We're still the blade you termed us, edging close to Berlin's heart. The tempered steel of Canada's men has smitten the Nazi horde. We'd like to take time out to thank the man who forged the sword. The man who forged the sword was inundated with job offers. There were apolitical options like the presidency of the University of British Columbia, but he was also approached by 4 different political parties. The Conservative Party, newly rebranded as the Progressive Conservative Party, approached Andy about becoming their leader, or working for them, drawing up a post-war construction plan. From the other side of the aisle, Mackenzie King inquired if Andy would want to return to the head of the Natural Research Council, or be a senator, or serve as Canada's High Commissioner to occupied Europe. Eventually, he suggested the highest position of all. Would Andy consider becoming the first Canadian to serve as Canada's Governor-General when the Earl of Athlon's term ended in May? On September 30th, Andy was retired from the Army with a promotion to full general, the 3rd member of the Canadian forces ever to achieve that rank, after Currie and Otter. He wrote letters politely refusing all the politicians who had tried to recruit him, and on October 13th expressed to Mackenzie King that he would be willing to be Governor-General. Less than 3 weeks later, however, the conscription crisis of 1944 changed everything. Infantry casualties in Italy were high. There was a surplus of personnel in the other components of the Canadian forces, especially the Air Force, but the number of infantry reinforcements fell short of the need by 15,000 men. Even though the war appeared to be nearly over, Stuart told the Canadian government that supplying 15,000 men was essential to complete the mission. That number could be achieved by relaxing the Army's mental and physical fitness standards, or by allowing men older than 38 or younger than 18 to serve. There were scores of fully trained and eager 17-year-olds who were just waiting for their birthdays to come around, boys who would be disappointed if the war ended before they aged up. Mackenzie King knew, however, that it would be political suicide to suggest that 17-year-olds go to war ahead of the zombies. Zombies was a derisive term for men who did not wish to go overseas, but had been conscripted for domestic defense work under the National Resources Mobilization Act. The Globe and Mail published a letter from the Toronto Maple Leafs owner Conn Smythe on its front page, stating emphatically that if the Army needed men, the zombies should be sent. Most Canadians agreed with him, but many did not. Mackenzie King's own cabinet was divided. Ralston indicated he would resign if conscription were not introduced, but Minister of Air C.G. Power said he would resign if conscription were introduced. On the morning of October 31st, Mackenzie King met with Andy. He explained that Ralston and his pro-conscription faction might cause the government to fall. The progressive conservative government that rose from the ashes would introduce universal conscription, a policy that would be intolerable to most Quebecers and perhaps lead to an insurrection in that province. Andy foresaw even darker consequences. The force that would be responsible for enforcing the order to press NRMA men into service was itself largely comprised of NRMA men. They would be more likely to rebel than carry out the order. King believed that the situation might be salvaged if Andy spoke publicly against conscription and took over Ralston's role as Minister of Defense when he resigned. Andy readily agreed. National stability was more important than party politics, and certainly more important than personal ambition to become Governor-General. In Andy's words, "It was an emergency. I belonged to no party, but I was a servant of Canada." King went immediately from Andy to the Governor-General and then met with his cabinet. The meeting waged on well into the night. Ralston initially walked back his promise to resign. In a rather dirty move, the Prime Minister brought out an old letter of resignation that Ralston had tendered 2 years earlier in a totally different situation, and he accepted that. That trick was legally binding, but Ralston re-resigned the next day. In his new letter of resignation, he wrote that, "Our differences are fundamental on the vital matter of reinforcing our troops." Mackenzie King balked at that, responding that they agreed completely on that vital matter. They merely disagreed on the method. On November 2nd, Andy was sworn in as Minister of Defense.
Following his visit to the Canadian Army overseas, Colonel Ralston resigns as Minister of National Defense when his recommendation that home defense troops be used for overseas reinforcements is not accepted by the government. General Andrew McNaughton is named as Defense Minister to succeed Colonel Ralston.
When the news reached the Canadian troops overseas, they were overjoyed. "Andy's back!" became the battle cry of the day.
I hope that I have made clear the advice I offer to the people of Canada as to the action which should be taken in respect to what I believe are the two most urgent matters requiring attention. I refer to the need to increase the flow of guns and shells to the fighting front, and to the need to ensure that the units in the field shall not lack for reinforcements. As regards the supply of shells, I particularly appeal to the women of Canada to come forward and take their places in the factories. As regards reinforcements, I have declared my faith that the only practicable solution lies in the maintenance of our traditional system of voluntary enlistment. I believe in obligations of honor voluntarily taken up, and I intend to use my best efforts to encourage and to lead.
Andy's Committee on Recruiting reported its findings. The NRMA men, they believed, fell into two general categories. Some refused to fight overseas because of material self-interest. Their factory and farm jobs paid as much as $7 per day, while the Army only paid $1.25. Andy believed that such men could only be reached by aligning their self-interest with overseas service, by announcing that when the war ended, which it would very soon, men who went overseas would be guaranteed priority in hiring. The second category refused to fight overseas because of group loyalty and a sense of martyrdom. The hostility toward men who didn't volunteer had hardened them against the prospect. These men, Andy believed, needed to be persuaded of the Allied cause by an appeal to their hearts. Just as important as any possible recruits, however, Andy also had to move the hearts of the majority of Canadians who favored conscription. On November 6th, he spoke at the Legion in Ottawa. He was greeted by cheers, but as he spoke of the need for recruits, those gave way to boos and chants of "Take the zombies! Take the zombies!" Shortly after that speech, Andy quipped that he must be the most hated man in the country. Mackenzie King replied that the dubious honor belonged to him. The first month of Andy's efforts yielded modest results. In the first week, 96 NRMA men volunteered for active service. In the second week, 173. In the third week, 280. In the same period, 3,077 men from outside the NRMA volunteered, mostly boys whose 18th birthday had arrived. It seemed exceedingly unlikely that the target of 15,000 men could be mustered in the 1 month remaining of 1944. Andy was particularly disheartened by the insubordinate attitude taken by George Perks of Pacific Command and his officers. They had such contempt for the NRMA men that they didn't want to facilitate them volunteering at the 11th hour. They wanted them forced. There were reports of some British Columbia zombies being placed in isolation in freezing temperatures to persuade them to enlist. Meanwhile, Brigadier Robert McFarlane in Quebec resigned in protest of the government not enacting conscription. It seemed likely that other officers would follow suit. On November 22nd, it became apparent to Andy and Mackenzie King that while civil strife would have been the result if conscription were enacted 1 month before, there was now a greater risk of civil strife if conscription were not enacted. The cabinet met to discuss how to gingerly reverse course. C.G. Power alone was unwilling to conscience conscription, and resigned.
The Canadian Parliament holds a critical wartime session to debate conscription, and at Ottawa the members gather. The Mackenzie King Cabinet has decided on a proposal for limited conscription for overseas war service. Throngs line up for places in the visitors' gallery, servicemen too, indicating the popular interest in the tense conscription debate. Leaders Bracken, Graydon, and McTague of the Progressive Conservative Party. M.J. Caldwell, leader of the CCF Party, and Minister of Justice St. Laurent, with other cabinet members, Minister of Pensions Ian Mackenzie, Minister of Munitions and Supplies C.D. Howe, and Minister of the Navy MacDonald. Colonel Ralston, who resigned as Defense Minister in protest against the policy of not conscripting for overseas, and Air Minister Power, who tendered his resignation. New Defense Minister McNaughton, who has introduced the proposal for limited conscription.
The next day, Mackenzie King read an order in council, granting Andy the authority to dispatch 16,000 NRMA soldiers overseas.
The Prime Minister at Ottawa yields on the conscription issue. The government announces an order in council authorizing the sending of 16,000 of Canada's 68,000 conscriptees overseas. Thus, additional reinforcements are immediately available for the Canadian Army's push forward to Berlin.
He then ceded the floor of the Parliament to Andy, who addressed the nation. Andy explained why introducing conscription a month ago would have been a dangerous mistake, but doing so now that the paramount need of reinforcements inadequate has been recognized throughout our land from coast to coast was essential. Many of the Conservative MPs were furious with Andy. Here was a man they had twice approached to lead their party. He had betrayed them when he had joined the Liberal cabinet, but now he was stealing their own position to save that government. They berated him until 11 p.m. when the House finally adjourned. Mackenzie King was amazed how Andy withstood their derision and maintained a sweet calm. On the way out, he told him, "I see you as a future Prime Minister of Canada." In that moment, however, the job probably didn't seem very appealing. The French-Canadian Minister of Justice Louis Saint-Laurent, a man who actually was a future Prime Minister of Canada, supported the change in policy. His word did much to quiet the anti-conscriptionists in Quebec. The move to conscription went over smoothly across the country, except in British Columbia. In Terrace, NRMA soldiers rioted, armed with anti-tank guns. Andy was then faced with the difficult problem of how to suppress a riot when any men he might have called on to enforce the peace were themselves immediately needed overseas. He landed on an unprecedented solution: radical forgiveness. He told his adjutant general to pass the word around that the minister is a soft-hearted old man. He knows that these men are not really mutineers, they merely have a grievance. No matter how urgently they are required, they will be given the chance of going home to tidy up their affairs and kiss their wives and sweethearts. As long as the rioters temporarily handed in their rifles, they would not face disciplinary action. They would get their guns back to point at the enemy when they reported for overseas service. Most of them did report and went on to serve effectively. Nationally, there were about 6,000 NRMA soldiers who went AWOL, but double that number went overseas. On December 8th, King secured a vote of confidence that marked the end of the conscription crisis. Arguably, the person who lost the most in the crisis was Andy. 3 months before, he had every expectation of becoming Governor-General. Now, most politicians derided him as a turncoat, a failure, or a fool, depending on their party. Even so, when asked about the conscription crisis decades later, he said, "I have since gone over every step many times, and if I had it to do over again, I would alter nothing." The same day as the confidence vote, the Prime Minister approached Andy about his next challenge. Almost all cabinet ministers are members of Parliament when they are appointed. When ministers are appointed from the outside, like Andy, they are expected to become MPs by running in a by-election as soon as possible. The Liberal MP for Grey North, the riding that included Owen Sound, Ontario, was ill. Mackenzie King asked him to step down so that Andy could win his seat. Everyone expected that Andy would win by acclamation. Throughout the war, the Liberal and Conservative parties had agreed to preserve national unity by not running against each other in by-elections. If an MP left office, their party simply chose a candidate to take their place. On this occasion, however, the Conservatives were out for blood. They decided to throw their full force behind an opposing candidate, the mayor of Owen Sound, W. Garfield Case. A third candidate, named Earl Godfrey, also ran entirely on the basis of a personal grudge against Andy. Case's campaign was vicious. First, they attacked Andy as a fancy man who flouted his wealth by arriving in Owen Sound in a personal train car. As we have seen, Andy was just about the least flashy person in the world. He had a personal train car because it was kitted with radio equipment that allowed him to keep abreast of events in Europe. He was Minister of Defense, after all. Then they attacked him on his wife's religion. Anti-Catholic firebrands claimed that Mr. McNaughton was controlled by Mrs. McNaughton, and Mrs. McNaughton was controlled by the Pope. Of course, the main thing they attacked Andy about was conscription. Not that he had introduced it, but that he had fought it for so long. The Conservative leader, John Bracken, spoke in Owen Sound, He claimed that Andy had created a great army only to abandon it, that he had stood up for zombies instead of the troops. Andy's advisors handed him a big blob of mud he could have slung back. Unlike Andy, Case had not volunteered for World War I. He'd gone only when conscripted. Andy refused to call his opponent a coward, though. He did no negative campaigning. He just calmly defended his own actions through an ocean of booing. Case's campaign did make one argument against Andy that was perfectly reasonable. He wasn't from the riding. Case's slogan was, "Send a Grey North man to Ottawa, not an Ottawa man to Grey North." That is ultimately what the voters chose to do. When the polls closed, there were 3,118 votes for the third-party candidate, 6,097 votes for Andy, and 7,333 votes for Case. It was one of the most surprising upsets in Canadian electoral history. The ebullient conservative press depicted Andy as Napoleon retreating from Russia, a national hero utterly defeated. Andy took the loss in stride. He was still Minister of Defense, and there was work to be done. As 1945 dawned, the Allies knew that a victory in Europe was assured and imminent. In February, the Canadians fighting in Italy were sent back to Northern Europe. The nation's one-time army was reunited, but not reinstated. Andy informed the British that most Canadian troops would begin withdrawing from Europe in late March. He committed a single division to remain for the occupation of Germany. He also promised that one division would go to the Pacific Theater, as the war with Japan was expected to outlast the war with Germany. In April, Mackenzie King specified in Parliament that the soldiers who proceeded to the Pacific would be volunteers. The number of Canadian soldiers in Europe who immediately indicated they would volunteer for the Pacific was more than enough to form a division. My grandfather, Adrian Bates, was one of them. But many Canadians believed that the zombies should go instead. As one letter to the editor put it, the government is not going to send the well-fed, well-sheltered, healthy, trained draftees. It is going to send the spirited, unselfish, gallant, but battle-weary young who fought our battles in Europe. Others questioned why the Pacific Force would be only one division. Andy explained that the situation called for bombs, not infantry. In his words, Canadians wouldn't slug it out hand-to-hand with a foe perhaps better fitted than we to survive in the jungle war. We will assist to smash the Jap forever with a maximum of machines and explosives. What Andy couldn't say aloud was that he had an additional cause to believe that the war in Japan would soon be over. He knew about the Manhattan Project. His notes from a meeting a full year earlier are an ominous game of fill-in-the-blank. We spoke of the... and the date R had said it might be used. I explained the nature of this device. A federal election was set for June 11, 1945. Andy needed to win a seat to remain in cabinet. He chose to run in Qu'Appelle, the riding that includes Moosomin. He loved his hometown, though he hadn't lived there in 45 years. The incumbent was Ernest Purley, who farmed in the area and had held the seat since 1930. And there was a third candidate, Gladys Strum. 1 year earlier, the Saskatchewan CCF won a provincial election in a landslide. Tommy Douglas became the premier, but rather unusually, he wasn't actually the president of the Saskatchewan CCF. That was Strum. She was the first woman in Canadian history to preside over a provincial political party. Strum had not won a seat in the provincial election, however, so now she was running federally. Throughout the campaign, Andy, Mabel, and their 21-year-old daughter Leslie stayed at the Queen's Hotel. Today it is the Uptown Bar, and as you can see, it is extremely close to Andy's childhood home. Traveling to every corner of the large riding was a shock to Mabel, who had never lived on the prairies. As she put it, driving through the gumbo at that season of the year is something unbelievable if you've never done it. She recalled driving toward Regina one night, seeing the city lights and exclaiming in relief, "Thank God we'll soon be there," to which the driver responded, "It's still 40 miles. You're on the prairies now." The Qu'Appelle riding in 1945 ended at Regina, but included some of its most easterly neighborhoods. That's where the McNaughtons were on May 8th, when Germany surrendered. They ventured into the joyous city to buy flowers in patriotic colors and send up prayers of thanksgiving. Andy went to an Anglican church, while his wife and daughter went to a Catholic one. Campaigning did not come easily to Andy. He read a book called Campaign Management and How to Win Elections, but it recommended kissing a lot more babies than he really had the stomach for. His wife later explained, "Andy was not a politician. There's no doubt about it. My argument is that he was too straight." One observer described him as stiffly erect, clutching his notes tightly but seldom looking at them. There was no animation, just a plain, straightforward recitation in a voice which seldom changes tone, and then only in anger. The editor of our local paper, the World Spectator, was more favorable, claiming, "If the campaign went on long enough, the general would win easily. It is instinctive to like him when you meet him." What some Qu'Appelle voters really wanted to know was why Andy had left his overseas command. Had he actually been ill, or had he fallen on his sword trying to keep the Canadian Army intact?
Had he abandoned his troops? Accurately or not, the Ottawa Journal reported the following as quotes from Moosomin area farmers. "The general must answer that question if he hopes to represent us. Seems funny to me that he won't. We can't understand it. It's my guess that he keeps his silence even at the price of losing the election." Andy was not willing to air his grievances about Ralston, Stewart, Brooke, Paget, or Montgomery on the campaign trail. There was still a war on, and despite everything, those men were still his comrades in arms. The most Andy would say was that he left the army because of a very serious difference in views on policy. That answer was good enough for 4,871 Capel voters, who chose Andy. 5,415 chose the established incumbent. The winner, with 6,146 votes, was Gladys Strum. If Andy had to lose, I'm proud that my community chose Strum. In Ottawa, she advocated for Canada to welcome more refugees after the war, especially children. Strum was the only woman elected in the whole country in 1945, and only the 5th female MP in Canadian history. The most devastating part of the election for Andy was that the soldiers from Capel who voted overseas overwhelmingly did not vote for him. Strum had written a personal letter of thanks to each one, which may have tipped the scales. Like Andy, Mackenzie King lost his riding to a CCF candidate. Nationally, though, the Liberals eked out a narrow majority with 52% of the vote.
From the CBC's Ottawa studios, Prime Minister, the Right Honourable W.L. Mackenzie King.
I cannot thank you too warmly on behalf of all members of the government. We in Canada have passed together through nearly 6 years of the strains and sacrifices of war. No one could have been too greatly surprised if you had blamed the government for all that has been experienced of inconvenience, of privation, and of sacrifice during these years of war. At no time did the opponents of the present administration adopt such a slogan. In the necessary but destructive tasks of war, we in Canada have amazed the world by the magnitude of our achievement. Let us now unite in a determination to make and to keep our country the finest in the world in which to work and live.
The Liberal candidate who'd won easily in Glengarry, Ontario, stepped down so that Mackenzie King would win his seat in a by-election. The Prime Minister wondered if he should ask someone else to do the same for Andy. He wrote in his diary, "It's a very baffling situation for me. I would like McNaughton in the government, and I feel that he is a real strength. I can see, however, that some of my colleagues may feel it would be inadvisable to risk a third election with him, at least at present." Andy told Mackenzie King that he was willing to step down. He was content with what he had accomplished as Minister of Defence. The war in Europe was over, and he had drafted a solid plan for demobilization. Just like after the previous war, Andy had decided the shape that the Canadian military would take in peacetime. Mackenzie King wasn't quite ready to let him go, though, and considered asking him to run in Quebec, where conscription was so unpopular that he would surely win. On August 6th, the Globe and Mail reported that Andy had been a cabinet minister for 8 months without a seat, far exceeding the previous record of 1 month and 20 days. They wrote that Mr. McNaughton must not stay in office any longer if responsible government has any meaning. That settled it for Andy. He insisted that the Prime Minister accept his resignation. August 6, 1945 is more notable for another reason, though. The United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. That atrocity precipitated the end of the war and determined the next stage of Andy's life. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The 6th Division of spirited, unselfish, gallant Canadian volunteers did not head to the Pacific after all. On August 20th, Mackenzie King publicly accepted Andy's resignation. He praised how much your membership in the government has meant to Canada, in helping to meet the problems which have arisen in the concluding months of the war, in the work of demobilization and in post-war organization. Your wisdom and far-sighted vision in dealing with these problems has been of inestimable value. One newspaper editor was decidedly unimpressed, writing that Mackenzie King and McNaughton both agree that what they did is for the best, and that to have followed any other course would have been to court disaster. This is the happy ending the collaborating authors have written for this chapter, and the Canadian public is now expected to roll over and go to sleep. A different paper caught the general consensus best with the lines, "An unhappy episode thus comes to a close. Most Canadians, we think, looked with distaste on the spectacle of General McNaughton's political interlude, because we prefer to think of him as the distinguished soldier, the eminent scientist, to whom Canada stands in debt for so many splendid achievements." Mackenzie King did not intend for Andy to stop achieving splendidly just because it was impossible to keep him in a public-facing government position. On the same day that the Prime Minister accepted Andy's resignation, he appointed him the Canadian chairman of the Canada-US Permanent Joint Board on Defense. The Joint Board also had an American chairman, the former mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia. What the tall, lean, serious general and the short, pudgy, flamboyant mayor had in common was how much energy they brought to the work. They planned all of their meetings as field trips to military installations across the continent. One month they might be at an airfield in the Yukon, and the next at a guided missile center in Texas. Coming out of World War II, it was clear that the only nation on Earth that could challenge the military might of the United States was the USSR. Canada was in the tricky position of being geographically between the two giants. Moreover, given the range of the era's V-2 rockets and B-29 bombers, the USSR could conceivably attack several major U.S. cities, but the U.S. could not reach any of Russia's, as they are all located in the west of that vast country. In the event of a war between the superpowers, the U.S. would need a tactical presence in Canada's Arctic. Andy's difficult task in the Joint Board was to cooperate with the U.S. in protecting the continent against potential war with the Soviets, while maintaining Canadian sovereignty. Andy had to guard against schemes by the Americans on the board to gradually and quietly subsume the Canadian military, like when they proposed that Canada reorganize its military's internal structure to match the U.S. model. Andy rejected that totally, but he was very interested in standardizing the equipment used by Canada, the U.S., and Britain to facilitate trade. Andy's first big move on the Joint Board was a sovereignty safeguard. During the war, the Americans had built many installations on Canadian soil, including a highway to Alaska. Andy insisted that Canada buy the buildings, the highway, and any equipment that was too heavy for the Americans to ship home. He negotiated a price of only $12 million for about $60 million worth of material. The real value, though, was in plucking out the tendrils of American ownership that had encroached too far. On January 10, 1946, the United Nations General Assembly convened for the first time.
For it may well be true that the world's last chance depends on the wisdom of UNO. Sitting beneath the emblem of the world, an unbiased North Pole view of it, by the way, Senor Zuleta, president of the preparatory committee, was in the chair. In the body of the hall sat groups of men and women. Mrs. Roosevelt is one of the United States delegates. Men and women chosen to represent the vast majority of mankind in this new effort to make life safe for the ordinary citizen throughout the globe.
The first resolution it passed was to create a United Nations Atomic Energy Commission to confront the nuclear age. Mackenzie King inquired what sorts of people the other relevant countries were choosing for the commission. When told that some nations were appointing diplomats or politicians, while others were sending scientists, he instantly responded, "McNaughton's all three." And so, in June, Andy was in the room where the Cold War started, as the UNAEC met for the first time. Their purpose was to draft a treaty on atomic weapons. Currently, the United States was the only country with nuclear bombs, so its representative, Bernard Baruch, was in a position to dominate the committee. He proposed the Baruch Plan. If all countries pledged not to develop nuclear weapons, and to submit to international oversight in their development of nuclear power, the U.S. would decommission its nuclear weapons and share the science behind fission with the world. Any country that violated the pact and began to develop nuclear weapons would be subject to condign punishment. Condign means a punishment that fits the crime, and in this context implies nuclear retaliation, or at least severe retaliation with conventional weapons. Lastly, Baruch insisted that the decision by the UN to enact punishment should, in an exception to the newly established norm of UN decision-making, not be subject to veto by one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The representative for the USSR, Andrew Gromyko, argued that the United States should decommission its nuclear weapons before asking the rest of the world to agree to international oversight of nuclear power, which could be construed as sanctioned espionage. He was also completely opposed to any exceptions to the veto rule. The majority of the countries in the UN were philosophically, culturally, and strategically aligned with each other, with Russia on the outside, so it needed its veto.
Absolutely necessary corrections.
Gromyko proposed an immediate weapons ban, with the question of international oversight on nuclear power and punishment for violators deferred to a later date. Echoing Canada's geography, Andy took a position between Baruch's and Gromyko's. He was the loudest proponent of international oversight. When he said, "The experience of the last 25 years have shown that international agreements without accompanying safeguards are not enough to guarantee peace," he was doubtlessly thinking back to the men clawing their throats at Ypres. The 1899 Hague Declaration forbade the use of projectiles to release asphyxiating poisonous gases. The Germans had not technically broken the law at Ypres, because the gas came from canisters on the ground, not projectiles, as if that was what mattered.
Andy insisted that international inspectors must monitor the mines where uranium ore is dug, the facilities where it's stored, and the power plants where it is used. Perhaps all nuclear facilities might even remain the property of the United Nations. He agreed with Gromyko, though, that getting a pact signed was more important than establishing the consequences for breaking the pact. Indeed, he took the punishment clause and the veto exception as evidence that the Baruch Plan was a sop to public opinion, and not a sincere attempt to create a pact that the USSR would sign. Andy wanted Gromyko to yield on the international oversight issue in exchange for Baruch softening the language pertaining to punishment and axing the veto exception. Gromyko was very receptive. The newspapers reported Andy's ability to work with him as evidence that Andy had the patience of Job. Really, though, Andy's secret was that, unlike the other members, he listened to the Russian without contempt. When Gromyko was seated next to Mabel at a banquet, he told her, "It's so easy to work with the general. He is never rude." Andy became, by common consent, the leader of the AEC's discussions. The French delegate, François de Rose, called him the conscience of the Commission. One anecdote from Andy's time at the UN AEC was much repeated in the press. Igor Guzenko had just defected to Canada, revealing the extent of Soviet espionage. The committee was meeting in the United States, and Gromyko complained that the American apples on offer were tasteless. Someone asked Andy which varieties of apples he fancied, and he said, "Macintosh Reds and Northern Spies." Everyone thought it was a great witticism, and it was repeated coast to coast as a good joke. But Andy hadn't intended anything but an honest answer to a simple question. In his own words, "I don't like humor." Andy's forthrightness earned him Gromyko's trust, and the USSR was inclined to accept international oversight of nuclear facilities. Alas, Baruch and his successors were unwilling to budge on the veto issue. The committee reached an impasse. No treaty was signed, and the arms race began. Andy had more success with the Americans on the Joint Board of Defense. He invited them to witness Exercise Muskox, a test of troop movement by snowmobile, and secured their support in developing a winter warfare research facility in Churchill, Manitoba. On February 12, 1947, the two countries signed a joint statement of cooperative defense. February 1948 was the first month that Andy ruled the world. The UN Security Council consists of 5 permanent members with the aforementioned veto power, and at the time 6 non-permanent members with 2-year terms. Canada was a non-permanent member for 1948 and 49, with Andy as our representative. The president of the Security Council changes every month, rotating through the countries on the council in alphabetical order. February 1948 was Canada's turn. 3 issues came before Andy in his first term as president of the Security Council: Kashmir, Palestine, and Indonesia. Former British India had just been partitioned into India and Pakistan. Under the terms of the partition, the princely states of Jammu and Kashmir had the right to accede to India, or to Pakistan, or to remain independent. The issue before the Security Council was how the state could hold an impartial plebiscite on its future when 2 rival authorities claimed the right to run the polls, and India and Pakistan both had troops in the area. One journalist described the scene. Most delegates looked at the provided maps of Kashmir indifferently, but the general sprawled his out over his desk and went at it as though he were that night going to invade the place. Brows knit. Andy and the committee determined that the plebiscite should be run by the UN. Andy proposed that representatives from India and Pakistan negotiate a coordinated withdrawal. Andy was no longer president when the mediation took place, but he continued to work for peace in Kashmir as a regular member. He ultimately arranged Canada's participation in UNCIP, the observer force that attained a ceasefire there. Palestine had many parallels with Kashmir. The British had administered the area under the Mandate, and now it was poised to be partitioned along religious lines. It was a hot spot that hasn't cooled even now, 78 years after Andy addressed it in a haunting speech. He said, "The consideration of this problem provokes deep and conflicting loyalties. The Security Council will agree, I know, that in our consideration of the question we should strive to free ourselves of every feeling except the determination to be constructive, unprejudiced, and realistic, and to avoid saying or doing anything which will aggravate the situation or to incite violence among those whom it is our earnest desire to help." Andy's commitment to caution ensured that none of the several proposed partition plans were enacted during his month as president. Rather, he supported the creation of a committee to gather more information and develop a more carefully considered plan. As for Indonesia, the Dutch had ruled the resource-rich island since 1800, but now its Muslim-majority population was fighting for independence. A truce drawn up in January was holding, but the ceasefire line left the richest oil and rubber regions under Dutch control. Andy wanted to ensure that a political settlement followed the truce, with no more bloodshed. He felt that the two sides needed a starting point to negotiate from. He resolved that the same committee that had negotiated the truce now draft a charter for Indonesian sovereignty that the two sides could alter in mediation. In Andy's words, I fully recognize that the resolution does not completely satisfy either party. Nevertheless, it is submitted in the hope of bringing about a meeting of minds, so that when negotiations are resumed, they may proceed from an agreed basis. February is the shortest month of the year, but Andy presided over the most Security Council meetings ever held in a month up to that point. The representative for Colombia called it one of the most fruitful in the life of the Security Council. One writer described Andy's diplomacy this way: "He appears to approach every argument in the belief that only misunderstanding and bitterness prevent a settlement, and if he sufficiently ferrets out the truth, everyone will join hands and live happily forever." Andy liked when the UN meetings were held in Paris. Mabel and Leslie enjoyed the opera and meeting fashion designers. Andy tolerated those aspects, but loved shooting pheasants with the President of France. The McNaughtons also traveled to Germany to visit Ian's grave, and to watch the continent returning to life after the death of so many young men. The worst part of serving on the UN for Andy was living in New York City, which was too claustrophobic for a prairie boy. His only pastime was tying flies and daydreaming about rivers cleaner than the Hudson. As for Canada, Andy's UN work had repaired his reputation at home. When he spoke in Ottawa about the UN Atomic Energy Commission, one poetic journalist wrote, "A shaggy magnetic man stood on an Ottawa platform this week, every inch a big leaguer. He was blunt, vigorous, majestic in his command of the topic, young with a timeless spring of spirit. At 61, the soldier's Andy has been a long way up, a long way down, and now he's come a long way back." Perspective had smoothed away the bitter days when he left his army command and 2 defeats at the polls. Britain, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands signed the Treaty of Brussels, a sweeping collective security agreement. Andy wanted the treaty to be expanded to include Canada and the United States. In the meantime, he continued his efforts to strengthen military tripartite cooperation between Canada, the United States, and Britain. In November, he achieved a long-standing goal that he said may sound trivial, but it was one of the greatest things we ever did. He convinced Canada's 2 closest allies to standardize which screw threads they used on military equipment. Previously, the U.S. might not buy a British airplane because it was held together with 100,000 bolts that were incompatible with its drivers, and vice versa. Canada, which purchased from both countries and supplied both countries, was forced to mix and match. Once Andy achieved screw thread standardization, military commerce began to flow more freely between the 3 nations, saving each party millions of dollars. 1949 began with a series of successes. On January 1st, a ceasefire took effect in the Kashmir, along a line that Andy helped to draw. There was new violence in Indonesia, though. On March 11th, Andy pushed for the 2 sides to meet again and discuss a draft of the sovereignty agreement that got called the Canadian Proposal. It proved to be acceptable to both sides as written. On March 23rd, the Netherlands announced that it would recognize Indonesian independence at the end of the year. Contemporary accounts hailed it as the UN's first unambiguous triumph.
In the Royal Palace at Amsterdam, the transfer of sovereignty creating a new independent republic, the United States of Indonesia, has been completed. Queen Juliana, attended by her ministers and in the presence of members of the States General, was the first to put her signature to the document.
There are 2 modern-day addenda to the story. In 2004, Indonesia posthumously awarded Andy its highest civilian honor, the Meritorious Service Star. At the ceremony, the Indonesian ambassador to Canada, Eki Shajrudin, called Andy a hero to Indonesians. Without McNaughton, our independence war against the Dutch and British would have gone on for many more years. In 2023, the Netherlands retroactively recognized that Indonesia had achieved its independence when they declared it in 1945, not when the Dutch conceded it in 1949. On March 31st, Newfoundland and Labrador became a Canadian province.
We, representatives of Newfoundland, are proud of our participation in this great event.
The problem that posed for Andy on the Joint Board was that the U.S. had bases in Labrador, where they claimed jurisdiction over legal matters. Always wary of foreign encroachment on Canadian soil, Andy persevered through a 5-day shouting match, and the Americans relinquished the special legal powers. On April 4th, Andy's vision of an expanded Treaty of Brussels came to pass, with the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. On June 20th, Andy witnessed a more personal alliance between allied nations when his youngest daughter Leslie married an American financier. Mackenzie King offered the toast to the bride. In August, the string of successes snapped when the USSR tested its first atomic bomb. The U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons was over, and the world suddenly felt a lot less secure. It was that quivering world that Andy took in hand in December for his second stint as president of the Security Council, which happened to fall on the final month of Canada's 2-year term as a member. The main task was the ongoing conflict in Kashmir. UNCIP reported that India and Pakistan might negotiate more productively if they did so before a single mediator instead of a committee. The council asked Andy to take on the job, and he did it with characteristic gusto. He attended 45 meetings in the next 21 days, with some starting as late as 11 p.m. He delivered a draft agreement for balanced demilitarization to both parties on December 22nd.
Feeling in the Christmas spirit, he served his staff a bottle of whiskey, took the 2 colored ribbons off the bottle, wrote P on one and I on the other, and stuck them to a copy of the agreement, joking that the ribbons were Pakistan and India's official seals of approval. As it happened, Pakistan accepted Andy's draft with only minor amendments. India initially rejected the draft, but Andy talked them down to simply submitting their own list of amendments. Everyone on the Security Council was impressed by the progress made. The member for Norway moved that Andy continue to mediate between the two states after his term as President of the Security Council ended. Alas, the Council determined that because Canada's 2 years on the Security Council were ending the same day, it would set a complicating precedent. Other non-permanent members might seek to prolong their role on the Council. And so, the last day of the 1940s was Andy's last as Canada's delegate to the UN. The next day, Andy became the Canadian chair of the International Joint Commission. Despite also containing the word joint, the IJC was very different from the Permanent Joint Board on Defense, on which he also continued to serve. The Joint Board was a vehicle for Canada and the US to collaborate toward common goals. The IJC was an essentially adversarial organization, in which Canada and the US navigated conflicts related to water. Water, famously, knows no boundaries. Decisions that either country made about international rivers or the ocean necessarily affected the other country. Developing sanctuaries for waterfowl in North Dakota might cause drought conditions in Manitoba. A tidal power project in Maine might affect the New Brunswick fishery. In every conflict, Andy fought for Canadian interests. When he was dining with Owen Dixon, the Australian who succeeded him as the UNCIP mediator, one of their dining companions said, "Well, General, it must be very peaceful dealing with disputes between Americans and Canadians after the Indians and Pakistanis." "Oh no," Andy replied before launching into the details of a particular dispute. One of Andy's passions was developing the St. Lawrence River for navigation and power generation.
The old canals were a bottleneck. Big lake boats couldn't get through the canals to Montreal, and large ocean-going ships couldn't reach the lakes. Only very small boats were able to use these old canals. A large modern waterway was needed.
From a national defense perspective, the main appeal of the idea was that steel ships could be built in the Great Lakes, very near to where the steel was produced, and then sailed out to sea. You will recall that Andy first worked on the St. Lawrence Seaway concept 30 years earlier as Deputy Chief of Staff between the wars. He participated in the technical studies for a binational development plan, but the required treaty died on the floor of the U.S. Senate. In the intervening decades, the story had repeated itself a few times. Successive U.S. presidents had generally supported the project, but they couldn't overcome the lobbyists who opposed it. They represented, in Andy's words, owners of jerkwater railways who have no concept of the common good. If ships could bring goods from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes, railroads that ship products from New York to Chicago would lose business. Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent proposed that Canada stop waiting for U.S. cooperation and build the seaway alone. It would have been prohibitively expensive, except for the possibility of recuperating the cost as hydropower, generated in the International Rapids section of the river. Andy realized they could circumvent the rail lobby by using a U.S. legal precedent dating to 1914. While American participation in the building of a navigable seaway definitely required congressional approval, the U.S. President had the authority to independently approve an electric project. As soon as Harry S. Truman appointed an American electric company to cooperate with Ontario Hydro, a power station could be built in the International Rapid. Canada could then use its half of the earnings to build the all-Canadian Seaway. In January 1951, while the Canadian plan for the St. Lawrence was causing waves to churn and sparks to fly in the U.S. capital, on the other side of the continent, an American hydro scheme was alarming Andy. The Americans submitted an application to the IJC to build a dam on the Kootenay River in Libby, Montana. The dam would raise the level of the Kootenay at the border by 150 feet and cause it to flood 42 miles into Canadian territory. The Americans felt comfortable proposing a plan that offered Canada significant harm and zero benefit because the IJC had approved similarly one-sided schemes before, like the Grand Coulee Dam. In Andy's words, they had every excuse for thinking that Canada was asleep. Now, though, Andy was on the committee. A U.S. Senator took Andy aside and told him, "Sonny, you'll either agree to the building of the Libby, or we will break you." Andy was amused to be called Sonny at the age of 65, but he was not cowed. He He claimed that if the Libby Dam were built, Canada would be entitled not merely to compensation for the flood damage, but to ongoing reimbursement that reflected the fact that Canada was providing the ongoing service of water storage. Andy argued that the Libby Dam shouldn't be built at all. If the Kootenay were going to be dammed, it should be dammed north of the border, so Canada could generate electricity too. The Kootenay was just one of the tributaries of the Columbia. Andy drew up a plan to maximize the use of the Columbia River system by both countries, that came to be called the Door Diversion. Canada would build modest dams at Door, Bull River, and Canal Flats, and a massive dam at Mica Creek. The waters of the Columbia would thus flow into the United States in a regulated way that would greatly reduce flooding, a service that the Americans should pay for. In Andy's grandest vision, the Door Diversion was merely the first step in a multi-decade plan that ultimately diverted some of the Columbia's waters by tunnel to the Fraser. While the IJC was deadlocked between the Libby Dam and Door Diversion plans, it continued to decide on smaller cases involving international rivers. Andy strategically let two decisions go the Americans' way, when he saw that they would create legal precedents that would benefit Canada in the case of the Columbia. In one, a Canadian concern wanted to irrigate the prairies with water that flowed from Montana. The American lawyers interpreted the Boundary Water Treaty in a way that benefited Montana as the upstream party. Andy readily agreed, knowing that Canada was upstream in the rivers that mattered most. In the second, a Canadian mining company wanted to build a dam that would flood 3 acres of U.S. territory. Andy happily offered ongoing compensation that reflected the flooded area's ongoing value as water storage. If the Libby Dam were built and flooded 15,000 acres of Canada, the precedent should ensure that the money came back 5,000-fold. By 1952, the knowledge that Canada would build a St. Lawrence Seaway with or without American support had sunk in south of the border. The New York Times told its readers, "The opposition from railways, shipping lines, and ports no longer makes sense. The plan will be as good for us as it will be for the Canadians." One of Truman's last acts as president was to promote the New York State Power Authority as the natural partner to collaborate with Ontario Hydro on a power station in the International Rapids. There were still rolls and rolls of red tape left to cut on the American side, though, which was a problem because Canada's rapidly increasing population needed more electricity immediately. Andy's family was in the news in 1952 for a strange reason. A wealthy aunt of Mabel's passed away and left her fortune to Andy and Mabel's son, Teddy, on the condition that he change his name from Edward McNaughton to Edward Leslie. Teddy complied, but reluctantly, because he was close to his father and proud to be a McNaughton. Andy had an abiding interest in aluminum because of its importance in building airplanes. Labrador was rich in unexploited aluminum ore, and as Andy flew over it in 1953, he spotted the perfect spot to generate cheap power to run aluminum mines, Churchill Falls. He mapped out a mine site and a route for a rail line to bring the aluminum to market. All of this he brought to the manager of Brinco, Newfoundland and Labrador's Industrial Development Consortium. Brinco took it from there. Involving 80 dikes and a massive underground powerhouse, the Churchill Falls project was, at the time, the largest civil engineering achievement in North American history. Andy spent 1954 arguing with Americans about both of the ongoing water disputes. President Eisenhower signed the Wiley-Dondero Seaway Act, permitting the U.S. to participate with Canada in building a navigable St. Lawrence Seaway. The Canadian public had become rather proud of the All-Canadian Plan, and were disappointed to see the U.S. butting in at the 11th hour. Andy was pleased to have the Americans help pay for the Seaway, but then they suggested changes to the proposed route. He had an impassioned meeting with the U.S. Department of Defense, explaining that the route was already optimized, and Canada would not tolerate further delays. On the Kootenay question, the U.S. finally conceded that if they built the Libby Dam, they would need to compensate Canada for the loss of hydropower generating flow north of the border. However, they intended to calculate the amount of electricity generating potential Canada was losing out on based on the natural flow of the river, not based on what it would generate using Andy's Door Diversion. In Andy's words, "They want us to give them a gold watch for the price of a piece of tinsel." Then, an American aluminum and chemical company proposed an even worse dam deal to the government of British Columbia. The firm wanted to build a dam in Castlegar, BC. They were prepared to give the provincial government 25% of the power generated. The Premier, W.A.C. Bennett, saw it as power for nothing, but Andy saw it as allowing a foreign company to steal 75% of a Canadian resource. Andy got the federal government to pass a new law stating that provinces could not undertake work on an international river without a federal permit. The permit would only be granted if the project was compatible with the present and future needs of the country, and optimum development of the entire watershed. A water resource could only be offered to a foreign entity if no effective use of the water could be made in Canada, and only then for compensation that fully reflected the value of the project. For the Joint Board of Defense, 1954 shone as the year that the Pine Tree Line went live, an interlocking chain of radar stations located in Canada just north of the U.S. border. The Pine Tree Line ensured that no Soviet bomber or missile could reach the lower 48 undetected. It was the first of 3 radar chains to be completed. The Distant Early Warning Line would follow in 1957, and the Mid-Canada Line in 1958. Andy insisted that the electronic equipment for all of those radar stations be made in Canada, a big boost to Canadian engineering. For Andy personally, the greatest moment of 1954 was a joint board meeting in which they flew over the North Pole. An ardent lover of airplanes, the same year he also chaired the committee to create a National Aviation Museum. In 1955, an independent feasibility study compared the proposal for the Libby Dam, the door diversion, and a compromise scheme. It found the door diversion to be the most efficient. An American proponent of the Libby Dam conceded that Andy was the best informed man on both the Canadian and American sides, and the best informed by far. It seems certain that Andy's plan would win out. That summer, Andy visited Moosomin as the guest of honor at the opening of Moosomin Lake Regional Park. He was presented with a key to the town. In February 1956, the Canadian Department of External Affairs agreed to closed-door meetings with the U.S. to iron out gaps and deficiencies in the Canadian plan for the Columbia. Andy was worried that Canada's new representatives might settle for a worse deal than they would with him in the room, but took heart that there weren't enough gaps and deficiencies to justify major changes. On April 9th, Louis Saint-Laurent announced that the future of the Columbia would no longer be determined by the IJC, because, quote, the chairman of the 2 sections had publicly expressed views so diametrically opposed to each other that there was little probability of their being able to make the kind of progress we would hope would be made in arriving at a solution. Andy was shocked. From his perspective, he and his American counterpart were just a few pen strokes away from agreeing to a solution that would greatly benefit Canada. For a few days, Andy left his Columbia frustrations half an ocean away and traveled with the Joint Board of Defense to the Eniwetok Atoll.
A chain of 40 tiny coral islands surrounding a lagoon is Eniwetok Atoll in mid-Pacific, part of the Marshall Islands freed from Japan in World War II.
There, after trying out his fly fishing skills on a rainbow of tropical prey, Andy witnessed the terrible majesty of a hydrogen bomb test.
Its death-dealing radioactive cloud spreads for miles above the Pacific. And Eniwetok Atoll, the world's mightiest agent of destruction, presents its unspoken and unanswerable argument for peace and for preparedness.
In 1957, the American Society of International Law confirmed that Canada's right to divert the Kootenay is clear and unmistakable. But the Department of External Affairs made no progress on an agreement with the U.S. Eventually, the Prime Minister returned the task to the IJC. One newspaper summarized the situation this way: Canada has need of the power, she has the water, she has the legal right, and we believe she has the right man with the right team to ensure that her natural resources are put to her own use. Too often we have seen our precious heritage of natural wealth given away for fast money or politicians' good neighborly whims. General McNaughton has a grave responsibility, but we may be sure that Canada's interests are in good hands when he enters the new round of discussions. We wish him well. In June, Canadians elected a Conservative government with John Diefenbaker as Prime Minister. Andy had been appointed to the Joint Board on Defense by the Liberals and supposed that Diefenbaker might want to replace him for that reason. Andy offered his resignation, but Diefenbaker declined. Diefenbaker's Minister of Defense was George Perks, whom we previously met as the insubordinate Pacific Command Chief during the zombie crisis. Perks suggested that the Joint Board stop their expensive fly fishing trips and meet in boardrooms in Ottawa and Washington. Andy argued that doing so would not result in economy, but prove very costly indeed. It was through personal experience with defense problems and defense personnel that the board members arrived at practical solutions. Andy made his point, and the field trips continued. Even so, in 1959, Andy stepped down from the Joint Board to fully concentrate on the Columbia question. The Americans at last agreed to all of the critical pieces needed to make a great deal for Canada. Water storage should occur at the highest point, to maximize the energy that could be captured by both countries. Downstream benefits should be split 50-50, and the U.S. should pay in perpetuity for Canada's water storage role that prevented flooding in the U.S. The Canadian press reported, "General Andrew McNaughton has the stuff that makes great Canadians. He deserves official recognition for this outstanding victory in getting Canada a fair share of downstream benefits. This feat will stand as a great achievement in the history of Canadian international bargaining." There was additional cause to celebrate. The actual construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway finally began, a full 40 years after Andy first worked on the idea.
Elizabeth of Canada and President Eisenhower of the United States opened the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Men have dreamed and worked for 2.5 centuries to make this river navigable. And now, at last,
the St. Lawrence Seaway presents to the world a 2,300-mile waterway of locks, lakes, and man-made channels.
On the occasion of the grand opening, an American dignitary wrote, "General McNaughton contributed more than any other individual." In June of 1960, however, Andy's hopes for the Columbia crashed like so much water over a bad dam. The Premier of British Columbia unexpectedly and unilaterally sabotaged the deal. Bennett stated that BC has no intention of allowing the construction of dams, by which he meant the dams that would have made the Door diversion possible. Bennett's opposition to Andy's plan ensured that the Libby Dam would happen instead, flooding a much larger and more valuable piece of British Columbia than the Door diversion would have. 6 months later, Diefenbaker and Eisenhower signed the Columbia River Treaty that permitted the construction of the Libby plus 3 dams in BC. One, the High Arrow Dam, was of dubious hydrologic value, and its construction would displace 2,000 British Columbians from their homes. Would Canadians at least receive 50% of the power generated downstream in perpetuity, the figure that had been previously agreed upon? Not at all. Canada agreed to accept a lump sum payment of $64 million. $64 million was more than Canada would have gotten if Andy had never introduced the concept of compensation for downstream benefits, but it was less than a fifth of the value of that benefit. Engineer E.W. Bowness examined the Columbia River Treaty and concluded, "This doesn't read as a treaty between friendly countries, but like one forced upon a conquered nation by the victors." A protest song by Joe E. Irving and Earl R. Fraser put it this way.
There's 7 wonders in this world, their names are known quite well. From Babylon Gardens to the Sphinx, the ancient stories tell. But now the greatest wonder is the folly in our land. They sold us down the river with the new High Dam. 4 miles up from Castlegar, the Columbia will be dammed, and the water that they store there controlled by Uncle Sam. This sets my mind to wondering just what the fate will be of the big Columbia River from the Rockies of BC. We could divert the Kootenai into Columbia Lake by way of Thompson River and on down through Hell's Gate. We could build a mighty complex of factories all our own and manufacture Canada's ore while foreign countries groan.
As 1962 dawned, the Columbia River Treaty was signed but not yet ratified, so Andy believed there might still be time to renegotiate it. Diefenbaker responded by informing Andy that on his upcoming birthday he would be retired under the Judges Act, which specified 75 as the mandatory retirement age for judges. Andy was not a judge. He was being fired. The Secretary of State for External Affairs, Howard Green, requested that Andy stay on for 5 weeks past his birthday to attend the 3-day conference that would mark the 50th anniversary of the IJC. Andy agreed on 2 conditions: that he be able to use the meeting to advocate for a renegotiation of the Columbia River Treaty, and that his retirement not be announced until after the conference. Green agreed, but on the morning that the conference was due to start, Diefenbaker publicly announced Andy's retirement, effectively evaporating his authority to discuss the treaty. Andy was livid. For the first time in his life, he exploded in front of reporters, calling Diefenbaker a black dictator. And on that sour note, Andy's long career in public service came to a close. Before the treaty was ratified, he took one last opportunity to speak against it, giving testimony in front of the relevant committee in the House of Commons. But it was too late. The disastrous treaty came into effect on September 16, 1964. In its wake, a bolder program of American appropriation of Canadian water emerged from the minds of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, called the North American Water and Power Alliance, NWAPA. The grand plan conceived of water as a continental resource, and planned to funnel it from the wet north to the dry south through 369 different construction projects. In his forced retirement, Andy fought against the NWAPA concept in speeches at the Canada Club, the Royal Society, and the Engineering Institute of Canada. Here is an excerpt from a speech he gave at the latter institution, where he won an award for the best engineering paper of the year at the age of 78. If the United States regards a 50-50 split of purely Canadian resources as equitable, they are dead wrong. Shared benefits are quite proper on an international river like the Columbia, or on a boundary river like the St. Lawrence. But the suggestion of splitting a resource entirely in Canada smacks more of plunder than cooperative development. When water is sold as a commodity, the owner is entitled to the full market price. But it must not come to that. We must resist any temptation in the foreseeable future to sell water of national origin to the United States, regardless of how attractive current prices may appear. One July weekend in 1966, Andy and Mabel's friends Chu and Betty Price came to stay at their cottage. Over dinner, Andy discussed the nation's water, and then they all went outside to watch a magnificent sunset. When the sun rose the next morning, Andy did not. He passed away peacefully in his sleep sometime in the wee hours of July 11th. The Governor-General announced his death in Parliament, saying, "He was a soldier to the end of his life, fighting for the causes in which he believed, with the integrity, candor, and tenacity for which he became famous. He was never a man to be intimidated by authority, and strove for what he considered to be right with a complete self-giving of all his powers. He was one of those all-too-rare human beings who combine a brilliant intellect with a dauntless heart." Andy's funeral service was held at Christ Church Anglican Cathedral in Ottawa. One of the hymns sung at his funeral was "Fight the Good Fight," which I have used throughout this video. The Governor-General and the Prime Minister led the procession of mourners from the church, the most poignant part of which was a black horse with no rider, led by a gunner of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. Andy's life included many disappointments. He saw Canada's first army split in half. He lost 2 elections. He felt the dream of a world without nuclear weapons evaporate, and saw a mighty river get sold for a quick buck. He was also witness to the deaths of too many young men. He faced every setback and heartbreak with the support of a devoted wife. Mabel died in 1971. Andrew's descendants varied in how faithfully they carried on his legacy. His son, Andrew McNaughton Jr., became a criminal who promoted and smuggled the dangerous quack cancer treatment Laetrile. His grandson, Andrew Leslie, son of Edward, became the commander of the Canadian Army and a member of Parliament. The Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers honors Andy's memory with a gold medal in his name. And in 1972, a new high school was opened in Moosomin and named for Andy. The McNaughton High School students of today can be inspired by his remarkable life.